They say the gray rot has no smell, but I am O.S Elderbranch, the first memory. Today, we begin with a girl named Kaelin. If you are ready to enter the forest, listen closely. This is Chapter 1, The Scent of Forgetting.
The gray rot had a smell, and it was the scent of forgetting. It lacked the honest, earthy musk of natural decay, carrying instead a dry, sterile odor like old bones ground to dust. The scent clung to the outskirts of Edgehaven, marking the threshold where the village's orderly fields surrendered to the ancient, brooding sprawl of the Elderbranch. It was a daunting, tangled maze of thorn and vine. Kaelin lived by that scent. To her, it was the smell of a promise breaking. She knelt, feeling the damp soil soak into her worn trousers. The weight of the forest's shadow pressed against her spine like a physical hand, making it hard to breathe. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, but she ignored it. Her focus was narrowed to the devastation before her, the patch of moon petals, now a skeletal ruin. She didn't need to touch the leaves to know they would crumble to ash. The life had been leached from their very structure, leaving behind brittle gray husks where vibrant green should have been. Her mother had called them starlight catchers, for the way their silvery blooms opened only to the stars. They were a living memory, and the rot was devouring it. The rot had started a month ago, a subtle leaching of color from the wilder edges of the village. The elders blamed a dry season, then pests, then the will of the gods. Kaelin knew better. This wasn't a sickness of the world. It was a sickness in the world. She could feel it in the soil, a deep, resonant coldness her own innate warmth fought against and lost. It left a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth and a weary ache behind her eyes. It was the price of holding back the gray tide. Her fingers, usually so sure and gentle, trembled as she cleared away the brittle leaves. It felt like tending to a corpse. A knot of frustration and grief tightened in her chest. She was supposed to be good at this. Since her parents had vanished into the deep woods 10 years ago, her garden was the only place she felt whole. They had left her with nothing but a half-remembered lullaby about the Grove Mother's tears and a legacy of whispers she could never quite piece together. It was the only place she was permitted to succeed, so long as her talent looked like simple hard work rather than the witch filth the neighbors whispered about. Giving up on the shears, she pressed her palm flat against the cool, blighted earth. Her eyes drifted shut. She sealed out the sight of the decay and the condemning line of the village fence just beyond her property. There were no strange words or dark powers. She simply spoke to the life she knew was still there. It was a silent, desperate plea sent from her heart down into the roots. Don't fade, not yet. Remember to grow. Grow. A faint warmth, like a held breath, bloomed against her skin. It was a familiar, secret feeling, a thrum of life that answered her own. She pushed, not with strength, but with an offering, a quiet invitation. The warmth spread, sinking into the soil like summer rain. A deep, resonant hum vibrated up her arm, a connection forged and accepted. She opened her eyes and pulled her hand back. The withered stalk had transformed. Gray receded from the stem, leaving a vibrant green in its wake. At its tip, a single, pearl-white bud appeared. Its waxy petals trembled as they unfurled, drawn out by her touch while the afternoon sun still held the sky. A sweet, clean scent pushed back against the sterile odor of the rot. It was the smell of air after a thunderstorm, carrying the fragrance of wet stones and her mother's hair. For a heartbeat, the garden didn't feel so empty. It was beautiful. It was life. But in Edgehaven, it was a crime.
"There, did you see?" The voice was sharp, slicing through her stillness. Kaelin flinched, her heart seizing. At the edge of her garden stood 3 boys, their games of dares forgotten. The speaker was Finn, the blacksmith's son,
His shoulders were already broadening from his work at the forge, and he wore a sneer that was a perfect copy of his father's. "She does that all the time," one of his companions whispered. It was Rorik, a lanky boy who shifted uncomfortably under Kaelin's gaze. "My mother says she sours the milk just by walking past the dairy." "She's not just a bad omen," Finn said. His voice was loud and accusatory as he took a bold step forward. His friends followed, flanking him like hounds. "She's a hagkin." The word struck Kaelin harder than a stone. The old slur was a brand for those born with the forest touch, a name for anyone whose blood was rumored to be mingled with the wild magic of the Elderbranch. To the people of Edgehaven, the term meant only one thing: unnatural. The same insult had been whispered behind her parents' backs before they disappeared. "I didn't do anything," Kaelin said, her voice barely a whisper. She instinctively tried to shield the blooming moon petal with her body. "Liar," Finn spat. "We saw you. You whispered to the flower. You put your witch filth on the petals." His eyes darted around the garden, landing on the small bundle of king's root she had harvested for Alara. With a sudden lunge, he snatched the herbs from her basket. "My father says your kind is the reason for the rot. You bring the forest's sickness with you." "The forest isn't sick," Kaelin snapped, a spark of defiance flaring through her fear. It's hurting." Finn laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "It's a forest. It doesn't hurt. It grows and it kills. And you're just a piece of it that doesn't belong here." He held up the stolen roots. "Maybe getting rid of these will fix your garden." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the bundle into a muddy puddle outside the fence. Cold fury washed over Kaelin. A humming power gathered in her palm, dangerous and hot. She could crack the stones beneath his feet. She could make the very roots of the Elderbranch rise up and crush the breath from his lungs. The images were so vivid, so tempting, that the power terrified her more than the boy ever could. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms. "Where are your parents, hagkin?" he taunted. His voice grew louder, playing to the audience of his friends. Did they get lost in the dark? Or did the forest just swallow them up like it does all the other unnatural things? The words struck a nerve, raw and deep. The careful walls Kaelin had built around her heart didn't just crumble, they shattered. But what rushed out wasn't the cold fury she had expected. It was a wave of pure, desolate sorrow. At that exact moment, the scruffy, one-eyed dog shot out from beneath a nearby bramble bush. He didn't bark. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a creature so thin and matted, a low growl vibrating in his chest. His one good eye burned with an intelligence far older than any stray's. He placed himself directly between Kaelin and Finn, his teeth bared. A jagged ridge of fur rose along his spine. The mangy dog, who usually cowered from every shadow in Edgehaven, was now an unyielding guard dog. Finn and his friends stumbled back, their bravado evaporating in the face of the dog's sudden aggression. "Get that beast away from me," Finn stammered, his voice cracking. Shaking, Kaelin knelt and retrieved the muddy roots from the puddle. Rowan relaxed his stance, nudging her hand with his wet nose. Kaelin didn't look at the boys. She simply turned and walked away, with Rowan trotting at her heels. A silent guardian and a faithful companion for the walk back to her lonely cottage. The public conflict was over, but the internal one was only just beginning. A narrow, overgrown path to Alara's cottage felt like the only safe passage in the world. Kaelin walked quickly, her gaze fixed on the dirt, with Rowan following as a silent shadow. She couldn't face her own empty home. Not yet. The silence there would only amplify the ugly words still ringing in her ears. She needed the warmth and the cluttered safety of Alara's home. She pushed open the heavy oak door without knocking, letting the scent of rosemary and wood fire wash over her. It was the smell of safety. Bunches of dried lavender and willow bark hung from the rafters like sleeping bats, their sharp perfume acting as a balm against the bitterness in her throat. Kaelin's gaze swept over the shelves, taking in the welcome chaos of cracked leather books and jars of colored powders. There were the objects Alara treasured: a spiraled fossil, a raven's feather, and a bowl of smooth river stones. Finally, her eyes settled on a single preserved flame leaf. Its faint inner warmth was a quiet promise against the cold world outside. Only then did she look toward the center of the room. Alara was as wrinkled as a dried apple, with eyes as bright and observant as a magpie's. She looked up from the pot she was stirring, her expression shifting as she took in Kaelin's appearance. "Kaelin, child, you look like you've seen a ghost." Kaelin couldn't find her voice. She simply held out her hand, offering the muddy, ruined king's root. It felt like a heavy, muddied weight in her palm, a symbol of her humiliation. Alara's eyes softened, with an understanding that required no words. She took the roots, her touch gentle, and began to rinse them in a basin of water. "Ah, those horrible boys again, and that ugly old word," she said, her voice a knowing rasp. She gestured with her chin toward a low stool by the fire. "I heard the shouting. Finn has his father's lungs and twice his ignorance." Kaelin sank onto the stool, letting the warmth of the hearth push back the chill that had settled deep inside her. They called me Hagkin." "It's a name for those who can hear the forest song, Kaelin," Alara said, her tone matter-of-fact as she patted the roots dry. "A name given by those who are deaf to it. Fear makes people foolish, and there is nothing Edgehaven fears more than the Elderbranch. They said I was the cause of the gray rot," Kaelin murmured, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Alara's movements stilled. She turned from her work, her gaze steady and piercing. "And do you believe them?" "No," Kaelin said, her voice finding a sliver of its earlier defiance. "I think the rot is coming from the forest. It feels wrong, like a wound." "That, child, is the bigger truth," Alara said, her expression turning grim. She hobbled over to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, its dark timber bound with rusted iron straps. As she lifted the lid, the sense of cedar and old parchment filled the room. She reached into the depths and pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped bundle. "Your parents thought so too," she said softly. "It is why they left." Kaelin's head snapped up. Her heart gave a sudden, violent lurch. Alara never spoke of her parents. Their names were a jagged silence that both women lived around, a mystery too painful to touch. "What do you mean?" Kaelin whispered. Alara unwrapped the object and placed it gently in Kaelin's hands. It was a simple leather cord, holding a smooth piece of dark wood, carved into an elegant spiral. It was cool to the touch and strangely heavy. Kaelin's thumb traced the carving. The wood acted as a key, unlocking a jolt of recognition that surged through her. For a breathtaking instant, the memory ceased to be a whisper and became a sudden, vivid reality. She felt the weight of the necklace against her cheek, and the scent of her mother's hair returned, smelling of crushed leaves and summer rain. She felt the rough wool of a tunic and heard a voice, thick with a love she had almost forgotten, whispering into her ear, "My brave little sprout." The vision vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving her breathless. "There was a change 10 years ago," Alara said, her voice low, sharing a secret she had kept for a decade. A subtle one, a silence in places that used to sing with life. "Your mother called it the hush. Your father felt a tremor in the deep roots. They believed the heart of the forest, the old pact, was failing." Kaelin stared at the necklace, her thumb tracing the carved spiral. It felt like an anchor to a story she didn't yet understand. "What does this have to do with the necklace?" "Your mother made this from a fallen branch of an ironbark tree," Alara explained. "She said it helped her listen. She called it a conduit for a deeper song." They went in search of the Heartgrove, a place deep in the forest, hoping to mend the pact. They never came back. The words were a flat, painful statement of fact. "No," Alara said, her voice laced with an ancient, weary sadness. "They did not, but the hush they spoke of has now become this rot. whatever they went to stop. It's only grown stronger. She placed a comforting hand on Kaelin's shoulder. That power in you, the thing that Finn and his fools call witch filth, is the same power that flowed through your mother. The villagers fear the forest, but your mother? She was the forest. She could make things bloom with a touch, a gift from the Grove Mother herself. It's not a curse, Kaelin. It's a heritage. The world blurred as tears pooled in Kaelin's eyes. For so long, her strange gift had felt like a brand, a mark of shame that was the source of her isolation. To hear it named as a heritage, a direct connection to the parents she barely remembered, was a profound and shattering relief. It felt as if a room in her heart, long kept in darkness, had finally been thrown open to the light. As she clutched the necklace, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth pulsed from the wood. It mirrored the secret heat that lived in her own palm. "What do I do?" she whispered. The question carried a terrifying new weight. "For now," Alara said, her tone becoming practical again. Her usual gruffness returned like a comfortable old shawl. "You live. You hold your head high. You never let them make you feel shame for the song you carry in your blood." Kaelin left the cottage a short time later. Her mind was reeling. The world felt larger and more dangerous than it had only an hour ago. She walked the path back to her lonely home, the velvet-wrapped necklace a solid weight in her hand. Her shoulders, which usually hunched inward to ward off a blow, felt a little straighter. Her gaze, which usually fixed on the dirt path to avoid meeting eyes, lifted slightly. Confidence was not yet a shield. It was a seed, fragile and tentative, but it had been planted. She was more than just the village outcast. At night, sleep proved a stranger. Kaelin sat at her wooden table, while the light from a single tallow candle cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. In a bowl of clean water, the moon petal glowed with a soft, silvery light. It was a small beacon of defiance. Rowan sat nearby, a scruffy creature whose fur had long ago taken on the parched, earthy color of the village roads. Caked in mud and matted by rain, he looked like a shadow carved from the very soil Kaelin tended. Only his one good eye remained clear, a sharp and watchful amber gaze that never left her face. Rowan was an outcast dog, a broken thing that had found a home with a broken girl. A heritage, not a curse. Alara's words echoed in her mind, a powerful counterchant to a decade of whispered insults. Her parents were not just wanderers lost to the wood. They were protectors. They had a purpose. Her strange connection to the living world was not a random flaw. It was a legacy. Her fingers traced the velvet cloth before she unwrapped the necklace once more. The dark, smooth wood of the carved spiral felt cool and inert in her palm. It was a piece of a story too vast to comprehend. The object felt less like a key and more like a burden. What could she, a girl who couldn't even stand up to Finn, possibly do with such a weight? The sounds of the village drifted through her shuttered window. She heard the distant clang of the smithy closing for the night, and the faint strains of a fiddle from the tavern. Tomorrow was the harvest festival. It was the one day of the year she was forced to be among them all, enduring their stares and their whispers. A fresh wave of anxiety washed over her. It was one thing for Alara to tell her to hold her head high, but another entirely to face the cold eyes of Elder Thane. With this new and heavy knowledge burning in her mind, she wondered how she could possibly pretend to be ordinary. How could she hide a heritage she had only just discovered? She looked from the dark necklace in her hand to the glowing flower on her table. One was a secret she had always kept. The other was a legacy she had only just been given. Tomorrow, she would have to walk a tightrope between them, praying the line didn't snap.
This is Chapter 2, A Spark of Devastation.
Kaelin awoke before dawn, the weight of a sleepless night heavy on her shoulders. Her thoughts were a swirling torrent of Alara's revelations and the looming dread of the festival. In the cool gray light of her cottage, she held her mother's necklace. Last night, it had been a burden. This morning, in the solitude before the world stirred, accepting it was a choice. Alara's words echoed in her mind. Never let them make you feel shame for the song you carry in your blood. With a steadying breath, Kaelin made a small, defiant decision. She slipped the worn leather cord over her head. The wooden spiral settled against her skin just above her heart, cool and solid. Once tucked beneath the collar of her tunic, it was a hidden shield, a secret truth known only to her. It was a first, tentative step toward the person Alara believed she could be. The harvest festival of Edgehaven arrived not with a joyous roar, but with a taut, hopeful hum. It was the sound of a community holding its breath, praying that the turning of the season would turn their luck along with it. The gray rot had gnawed at the edges of their prosperity for months. Now the ancient rites of fire and feasting felt less like a celebration and more like a desperate plea to the heavens. Kaelin felt the tension like a physical weight. She stood at the outermost fringe of the village square, a ghost at the feast, drawn there by Alara's firm insistence. Hiding is the same as admitting guilt, the old woman had rasped, pressing a small, lopsided honey cake into Kaelin's hand. Go, let them see you are just a girl, not a monster from their fireside tales. It was hard to feel like just another girl when every gaze that slid past her was laced with suspicion. Her own eyes scanned the square, searching for a place to hide. She saw ribbons in faded gold and rust. Their forced cheerfulness was a stark contrast to the granary, where the sheaves of wheat were pitifully thin compared to years past. In the center of it all, the great unlit bonfire stood like a silent accusation, waiting for a dusk she dreaded. Even the thick scents of baking bread and roasting meats felt thin. They were unable to mask the sterile odor of the rot that clung to the air like a shroud. Kaelin kept her head down. Her focus remained on the honey cake in her hand, its sticky sweetness a small, tangible comfort. She watched the life of the village swirl around her, a world she could see but never breach. Children with faces sticky with jam chased each other in wild, laughing circles. A group of young men, Finn among them, engaged in a boisterous contest of strength as they lifted heavy barrels to the cheers of onlookers. Finn caught her eye for a moment. His triumphant grin curdled into a familiar sneer before he turned away, dismissing her. It was a small thing, a mere flick of an expression, but it reinforced the invisible wall that stood between Kaelin and everyone else. A small girl with braids the color of corn silk, no older than 5, toddled away from her mother. She stopped in front of Kaelin, her blue eyes wide with simple curiosity, and held up a slightly wilted dandelion. Kaelin's heart constricted. Slowly she knelt and reached out to accept the small gift. Her fingers had just brushed the girl's when a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Maeve, come away from there." The girl's mother swooped in, snatching her daughter's hand and pulling her back with a force that was rougher than necessary. The woman didn't look at Kaelin. Her fear was a palpable thing, a cold wave that washed over the space between them. The dandelion fell to the dusty ground, forgotten and crushed. Kaelin's daze darted away, only to be snagged by another. Elder Thane stood by the steps of the meeting hall. His arms were crossed over his ceremonial robes. He was a man carved from hard opinions and harder winters. His eyes cut through the crowd, finding her with an unnerving precision. Unlike Finn, his look wasn't hot with anger. It was cold with an analytical certainty that made her skin crawl. He looked at her as though she were a blighted plant he was assessing for uprooting. To him, she was not a lonely girl. She was a problem waiting for a solution. A shiver traced its way down her spine. Kaelin pulled her thin shawl tighter, wishing for nothing more than the sanctuary of her quiet cottage. Dust began to bleed purple and orange across the sky as the villagers gathered. The laughter and games subsided, replaced by a solemn, expectant silence. Families drew together, their faces turned toward the unlit pyre in the center of the square. This was the heart of the festival, the moment intended to define the year to come. The sacred fire was meant to be a beacon of hope. Its flames were a promise of life and warmth, designed to ward off the winter and the deeper chill of the gray rot. Kaelin remembered festivals from her childhood before her parents had left. In those years, the fire had caught on the first strike, sending a triumphant howl of light through the square. This year, the silence before the spark felt heavier. Elder Thane moved to the center of the circle, his presence commanding. He held a flint and steel, tools of the ritual passed down for generations. The crowd drew a collective breath. On this day, Thane's voice boomed, deep and resonant. We offer this fire to the sky and the soil. We burn away the sorrows of the year past, the blight on our crops, the sickness in our herds, the fear in our hearts. He struck the flint. A weak spark flew, only to wink out on the damp tinder. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Thane's expression tightened. He struck again, his movements more forceful. But the spark was feeble and swallowed by the twilight. The collective anxiety became a physical weight. A failed fire was the worst of all omens. It meant their offerings were rejected and their pleas unheard. It meant the darkness was winning. Standing at the back, Kaelin felt their panic as a physical force. The cool wood of her mother's necklace warmed against her skin. It was as though a faint hum of power were answering the raw, desperate emotion of the crowd. An instinct deep within her rose to meet it. It was the same desperate need to soothe and to mend. A heritage, not a curse, she thought. Her hand instinctively went to the hidden spiral. Her mother could make things bloom. Perhaps this power wasn't something to hide. Perhaps it was something that could help. She wanted the fire to light. She wanted to see the fear on those faces replaced with relief. She sent a silent, fervent plea from the core of her being. It was a tiny, focused push of her will, channeled through the legacy of her mother. Please, light. Give them this one good thing. Let them have their hope. The spark that answered her plea was not the flicker of flint on steel. It was a silent internal ignition. The bonfire didn't catch. It erupted. With a deafening, concussive roar that stole the air from every lung, the pyre exploded into a pillar of violent, impossible life. The flames surged 50 feet into the air. They weren't the familiar orange and red of a normal fire, but a terrifying vortex of emerald green and brilliant gold. The heat was a physical blow. It forced the entire crowd to stumble backward while shielding their faces with cries of shock and terror. The fire sounded like a great beast waking from a long slumber. It consumed the massive oak logs in moments. The ghastly green and gold light washed over the square. It cast wild, dancing shadows that twisted the faces of her neighbors into monstrous masks. Panic shattered the solemnity. People were screaming and scrambling away from the inferno. Their prayers were forgotten in the face of such terrifying power. The fire remained contained to its stone pit, but its unnatural life was an undeniable violation. It was a sacrilege at the heart of their most sacred rite. A phantom echo of that power slammed back into Kaelin. It was a physical force that made her teeth ache and her vision swim. The scent of ozone and alien blossoms filled her lungs. The perfume was so thick, it was suffocating. The strength fled from her knees. She stood frozen, with her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with the scale of her mistake. She had wanted to offer a candle flame. Instead, she had unleashed a star. No, no, not like this, she thought. The scream was silent in her mind. They'll see. They'll finally have their proof. Through the shimmering, ghastly light, Elder Thane turned. His face was a mask of fury. His eyes burned with a cold fire of their own. He scanned the terrified crowd, and then he found her. The weight of his gaze was a physical thing. It pinned her in place. While everyone else ran, Kaelin could only stand frozen in a pool of horrified stillness. His eyes locked onto hers. In them, she saw no doubt. He knew. You. His voice was a raw, accusing roar that sliced through the din. He pointed a trembling, condemning finger directly at her. This is your doing. This is witchfire. He strode toward her, his long shadow leaping ahead. His fear had found an object. It was swiftly transmuting into the hard, satisfying certainty of righteous anger. The crowd, desperate for someone to blame for the terror, turned as one. Their panicked eyes fell upon Kaelin. In an instant, 100 separate fears sharpened into a single, lethal blade of blame. We have tolerated your ill luck and your cursed touch for too long, Thane bellowed. He stopped just before her. The blacksmith, Finn's father, moved to stand beside the elder. His massive arms were a barricade of muscle and conviction. Others followed, forming a hostile, closing circle. You have brought the forest's chaos into our celebration. You have tainted our sacred fire. Kaelin felt the air leave her lungs. The circle of faces was a blur of anger and terror. They weren't seeing her anymore. They were seeing a monster. A scapegoat for the gray rot and the failed harvest. I didn't mean to, she stammered, the words feeble and useless. But in their panicked state, her admission of involvement was a confession. It was all the proof they needed. Enough! A sharp, raspy voice cut through the rising anger. Alara pushed her way through the human wall. Her small, stooped frame radiated a surprising force as she placed herself between Kaelin and the elder. She is a child. It was an accident. Her heart is good, Thane. You know it is. Her heart is tangled with the Elderbranch. Thane spat, unmoved. And the forest has no heart. It has only hunger. He looked down at Alara with cold dismissal. You have sheltered this blight for too long, old woman. Be thankful we do not condemn you alongside her. Alara's face finally crumpled with a sorrowful defeat. She knew this battle was lost. The village's fear was a tide too strong to turn. Elder Thane turned his full attention back to Kaelin. The fire behind him was beginning to die. Its magical fuel was spent, leaving behind a pile of pulsing embers that cast a sick, reddish light on the silent tribunal. His voice dropped. It grew colder and heavier. Each word was a stone cast upon her. Kaelin, he said. The use of her name was a formal stripping of any last shred of community. For bringing unnatural and dangerous magic into our midst, and for profaning our most sacred rite, you are banished from Edgehaven. The word hung in the sudden, dead silence of the square. Banished. You will leave at dawn, he continued. His voice was void of any emotion. You will take what you can carry, and you will walk into the forest that spawned your kind. If you are seen within sight of our fields after sunrise tomorrow, you will not be given a warning. You will be treated as the monster you are. He sealed the judgment with a sharp, final nod. The circle of villagers began to break apart. Their purpose was served. They did not look at her as they left. They averted their eyes and shuffled away to their homes. As the circle broke, Kaelin's gaze accidentally met that of Rorik. He looked away instantly. He couldn't hide the flicker in his face, not the hard satisfaction of the others, but a pale, frightened shame. Then he too was gone. She was left in the sudden, vast emptiness of the square. Ilara reached out a trembling hand, but Kaelin was beyond her touch, trapped in a bubble of cold shock. Kaelin stood alone in the center of the ruin. At her feet, the dying embers cast her shadow long and solitary across the stones of the empty square. She looked away from the silent houses. Beyond the rooftops loomed the Elderbranch, a dark wall of ancient mystery. The wooden necklace against her skin pulsed once. One world had violently rejected her. The other was waiting.
This is Chapter 3, The Threshold of Thorns.
Sleep proved a stranger. Kaelin spent the night watching the shadows in her cottage lengthen and shrink as the moon traced its lonely arc across the sky. In the pre-dawn hush, the world was a palette of cold gray. It was the kind of flat, lifeless light that precedes a dawn you wish would never come. She moved through the single room with limbs that felt distant and disconnected. There was no panic or frantic rush. The shock of the previous night had settled into a heavy ache in her bones. It was a silence so profound it had swallowed all other feelings. She felt like a ghost in her own life, performing the last rites for a future that had died in the fire. Her fingers, usually so deft and sure, were unresponsive as she packed a small, worn satchel. She found herself watching her own hands to ensure they picked up the right objects, as if they were tools belonging to someone else. Each motion was automatic, a hollow echo of purpose. She packed a water skin filled from the rain barrel and a small, sharp knife used for pruning herbs. Its wooden handle was worn smooth by years of her own work. There was nothing else. When stripped down to what she could carry, her life was a pitifully small collection of things. Every object she touched was a memory. Each was a phantom limb of a life now being amputated. Her hand drifted over the cracked leather cover of her mother's book of plant lore. For a moment, she could almost feel the warmth of the hands that had held it so many times before. She ran her thumb along the worn curve of a garden trowel leaning against the wall. It felt like saying goodbye to old friends. These were inert objects now, cold to her touch, but they were the only proof she had that her quiet life had ever existed at all. A soft creak from the door made her flinch. Her heart seized. She expected an angry villager or a guard sent to hurry her departure. But the figure who slipped inside was small and stooped. The woman carried a tiny lantern. Its flickering flame cast long, warm shadows that pushed back the cold gray of the room. Ilara, Kaelin breathed. The name was a knot of relief and sorrow in her throat. The old woman moved with a quiet urgency. Her bright, magpie eyes took in the packed satchel and the desolation written across Kaelin's face. Ilara didn't waste time with pity. She came forward and pressed a small, tightly wrapped oilcloth bundle into Kaelin's hands. It smelled of dried moss and pungent herbs. "For the path ahead," Ilara said. Her voice was a low, steady rasp. "Crushed yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain, and a bit of dried honey cake for strength. The forest provides, Kaelin, but it rarely provides what you need at the moment you need it." Kaelin could only nod. Her throat was a tight knot of unspoken goodbyes. Ilara's gaze dropped to the dark wood spiral resting against Kaelin's collarbone. "Trust that," she said, her voice finally softening. "It will not lead you astray. That wood remembers the way, even if your mind does not." She reached out. Her hand was as wrinkled as a dried apple as she cupped Kaelin's cheek. "Listen to me, child. Do not let their fear become your own. Do not let their smallness shrink your heart. Edgehaven banished a girl today, but the Elderbranch is waiting for a guardian." The words were a spark in the hollow darkness of Kaelin's grief. A guardian. The idea was so vast and so impossible that a dry, humorless laugh almost escaped her lips. She looked down at her own trembling hands. "I don't know how," she whispered. You will learn, Alara said with unshakable certainty. She pulled Kaelin into a fierce, bony hug. It was not a soft embrace. It was a hug that tried to impart a lifetime of strength and stubborn defiance in a few short seconds. I would walk with you if these old bones would carry me, she rasped, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely showed. But this is a path you must walk alone. Go now, before the sun is truly up. Be brave, Kaelin, and be worthy of the song in your blood. With a final look that carried more weight than words, Alara vanished into the pre-dawn shadows. She left behind only the scent of herbs and the lingering warmth of her presence. Kaelin stood for a long moment, the oilcloth bundle clutched in her hand. The hollowness inside her remained, but a tiny defiant flame now flickered within it. Ilara's words, her mother's necklace, the weight of a legacy she was only just beginning to understand. A wet nose nudged her hand. Rowan had been a silent observer of the exchange. He rested his heavy head on her knee, his one good eye fixed on her face. Kaelin sank to the floor and buried her face in the thick fur of his neck. Her body finally surrendered to a single, shuddering, tearless sob. He was the only one left. As the first fragile fingers of dawn light touched the gray sky, tinting the edges of the clouds a bruised purple, she knew her time was up. She stood, her movements stiff, taking a deep, steadying breath. She took one last look around the small, sparse room. She saw the empty stool by the fire, the worn patch on the floor where she slept. On the table, the moon petal still glowed faintly in its bowl, a testament to her crime and her gift. She walked to the heavy plank door and lifted the iron bar from its bracket. The sound was a loud, final thud in the morning stillness. She pulled the door open. A draft of cool, damp air rushed in to meet her. Her first instinct was to pull it shut, sealing the memory of this room away from the world that had rejected her. But then another thought took root. It was a thought as small and sharp as a thorn. No. Instead of shutting it tight, she deliberately left the door ajar. This is still my home, she thought. A spark of defiance flared in the hollow ache of her chest. You can banish me, but you cannot erase me. With her satchel over her shoulder and the precious bundle from Ilara secured inside, Kaelin stepped out of her cottage for the last time. Rowan remained a silent, steadfast presence at her side. She did not look back. The main path leading out of Edgehaven was a ribbon of pale, hard-packed dirt, etched into the landscape by generations of footsteps. This morning, Kaelin's were the only ones upon it. She walked with her head held high, a small, desperate act of pride in the face of utter humiliation. Rowan trotted silently at her side, a dark, loyal shadow in the early dawn. His presence was a comfort, but it did little to ward off the oppressive feeling of being watched. The village was still wrapped in the slumber of early morning, the windows of the cottages dark and shuttered. Yet, Kaelin could feel the weight of 100 unseen eyes. She imagined the villagers in their beds, listening for the sound of her departure. She pictured them peering through the cracks in their shutters, their faces grim with the satisfaction of a problem solved. Every house she passed felt like a silent judgment. Every closed door was a final rejection. The silence was heavier and more condemning than the shouts of the night before. Then the sounds began, each one a sharp twist of a knife in her heart. There was the first ragged crow of a rooster, a sound she would never wake to again. Then came the distant, rhythmic clang of the forge, a pulse that had been the backdrop to her entire life. Now, that rhythm was no longer hers. Even the low, mournful moo of a cow from the dairy felt like a goodbye. These were the mundane sounds of a life she was now forbidden from, the heartbeat of a world that had cut her out like a diseased root. Her gaze stayed fixed on the point where the path met the forest. Looking back at the tended fields or the rooftops of her home was a risk she couldn't take. To do so would invite a wave of grief so vast it might pull her under. Instead, she focused on her movement. One foot in front of the other, a metronome of loss. The last marker of Edgehaven's territory was a crooked fence post, weathered gray by years of sun and rain. It was the unofficial boundary between the world of men and the world of the forest. As Kaelin's worn leather boots passed it, something inside her shifted. It was a feeling so unexpected it made her halt for a single stunned heartbeat. Mingled with the profound, aching grief was a startling, clean sliver of relief. For as long as she could remember, her life had been lived under constant, crushing pressure. The villager's fear had been a yardstick against which she had to measure every word and every action. With that single step past the fence post, the immense weight evaporated from her shoulders. The air felt lighter. Her lungs seemed to expand more fully in her chest. The fear of what lay ahead in the Elderbranch was a vast and terrifying ocean. But it was a clean fear. This was an honest, primal fear of fang, frost, and starvation. Dangers that would test her body while leaving her soul untouched. It was a clean fear, free from the slow, creeping poison of the village's shame. Out here, she thought with startling clarity, a wolf might kill me, but it will not hate me. The path ahead was terrifying, but for the first time in her life, it was entirely, unequivocally hers. No one would judge her footsteps in the wild. Kaelin stopped at the edge of the wood. The Elderbranch was more than a collection of trees. It loomed before her as a single, breathing entity, a great, dark green ocean, ancient and watchful. No gentle slope offered entry. There was only a sudden, tangled wall of bramble and blackthorn, whose branches twisted together to form a dark archway. Faded ribbons and small, carved charms hung from the lowest branches. These were offerings left by hunters or fools who had dared to step beyond the safety of the fields. The canopy was so thick that the morning light barely penetrated the leaves, creating a wall of deep and mysterious shade. At this threshold, the air itself changed. The familiar sense of wood smoke and livestock gave way to something wilder and richer. It smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and wet stone. It was the scent of a deep life that was utterly indifferent to human concerns. Kaelin stood at the threshold of two worlds. Behind her, Edgehaven was already fading into a ghost of whispers and closed doors. Ahead, the forest stood as a vault of secrets, holding the truth of her parents' fate and the weight of her own name. A deep breath filled her lungs with the wild scent of the wood. Kaelin made her choice. Her first step left the villager's hard-packed path for the soft, yielding moss of the forest floor. The ground seemed to sigh under her weight, as if accepting her presence. The journey of the outcast was over. The journey into the wild had begun. Her second step was blocked by a low-hanging branch of blackthorn. It was heavy with sharp spines and snagged with a villager's faded prayer ribbon. Before she could duck under the barrier, a sudden, soundless breeze rustled that single branch. The air remained motionless against her skin, yet the wood lifted away to clear her path. It settled back into place behind her like a closing gate. Logic named it the wind. Instinct called it a greeting. The border was more than a line on a map. It was a wall Kaelin could feel. One moment, the familiar sounds of Edgehaven were at her back. The next, she passed through the living gate of Thorns, and the world fell silent. Every trace of the village was swallowed by a silence so profound it felt like a living presence. The air grew cool and damp. It carried the heavy, rich perfume of 1,000 years of growth and decay. Above her, the dense canopy filtered the morning light into deep green shadows and shifting, luminous shafts of gold. Kaelin felt as though she were sinking into the depths of a vast emerald sea. The forest floor was a soft, forgiving carpet of moss and damp earth that swallowed Kaelin's footsteps. Rowan had trotted dutifully on the hard-packed dirt of the village paths, but here he moved with a new and predatory grace. Alertness radiated from his every muscle. His nose twitched constantly, and his ears swiveled to catch noises Kaelin couldn't hear. He was no longer a village stray. He was a creature of the wild, and he was home. Kaelin stopped, straining to listen. She realized the familiar sounds of her old life had been replaced. In place of the smith's hammer came the dry, rustling skitter of something unseen in the undergrowth. Instead of a cow's lowing, there was the high, piercing call of a bird she could not name. Beneath it all, an ancient oak groaned as it settled its weight, a sound like a giant stirring in its sleep. The forest was not silent. It spoke in a language she did not understand, where every syllable felt vast and complex. And it was watching her. The sensation was so pervasive that Kaelin froze. Her heart thumped a heavy rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the impenetrable walls of green, searching for a hidden predator or a pair of glinting eyes, but she found nothing. This was not the sharp focus of a single creature stalking its prey. It was something far larger. Every tree, every stone, and every shadow acted as an eye. All of them were turned upon her. The watchfulness was utterly different from the judgmental stares of the villagers. Edgehaven's gazes had been hot with fear and sharp with a need to find blame. This sensation was something else entirely. It was not hostile, nor was it welcoming. The presence was ancient and impartial. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath as it assessed her passage through its domain. It was the gaze of a slumbering god that had just opened one eye to see who dared to walk across its floor. Kaelin walked on. Her path was guided by a faint, intuitive pull in her chest, rather than her sight. The sensation emanated from her mother's necklace, a subtle warmth against her skin that grew stronger when she faced one direction and cooler when she turned away. It was a compass guided by a forgotten memory. She had no choice but to trust it. With every step deeper into the woods, her thoughts swirled in a confusing torrent of fear and hope. Was she walking toward her doom, as the villagers believed? Was she a blight, a piece of unnatural chaos being drawn back into the wild sickness that had spawned her? Fear was a cold weight in her stomach. Every snapping twig sounded like a pursuing footstep. Every shadow resembled a waiting monster. But then Alara's words would surface. A small point of light in the darkness. A heritage, not a curse. The forest is waiting for a guardian. Perhaps the forest was not judging her. Perhaps it was waiting for her. The hope was a fragile, terrifying thing, almost more painful than the fear, because it felt so easily crushed. She was caught between two powerful currents. One was a lifetime of ingrained fear that named her a monster trespassing in a dangerous world. The other was a seedling of hope that whispered she might be something else entirely. She might be a key, returning to the lock it was made for. Her fingers clutched the wooden spiral. Its smooth surface was a tangible link to a past she couldn't remember and a future she couldn't imagine. Lost, banished, and utterly alone, save for the dog at her side, Kaelin walked on. She was a solitary question mark, moving through the heart of a great, breathing mystery. Hours stretched and distorted, marked only by the shifting angle of light through the high canopy. The trees had grown into ancient, gnarled giants with trunks wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Their bark was a thick, furrowed hide of moss and time. Every recognizable landmark had vanished. There were no trails here and no signs of woodcutters. No human had set foot in this part of the Elderbranch for a century or more. Kaelin was adrift in a world she did not know. As the sun's warmth vanished, a chill snaked up her spine. Exhaustion, a dull ache only moments before, now pulled at her like a lead weight. Terror sharpened the simple logic of survival. She needed shelter. She needed fire. The unseen rustling in the undergrowth, which had seemed merely mysterious in the daylight, now sounded like the stalking tread of a predator. Kaelin's heart fluttered, like a trapped bird against her ribs. She stopped, sucking in short, sharp gasps of air that failed to reach her lungs. Her eyes darted into the deepening gloom, twisting every shadow into a waiting monster. "Fool," she whispered to the silence. "You are a fool to have come so far." Rowan saw it first. He let out a low, soft whine of curiosity and nudged Kaelin's hand with his nose. She followed his line of sight, the panic caught in her throat. On the trunk of an ancient oak, a patch of moss had begun to glow. It was not a reflection or a trick of the fading light. It was a soft, efflorescent radiance of an impossible emerald green. The light pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic beat, the pace of a sleeping heartbeat. It cast a small pool of light onto the darkening forest floor. As Kaelin stared, another patch of moss, a dozen paces ahead, began to glow. Then another beyond that. These were not random growths. They were lanterns lit for her. They formed an undeniable path through the deepening gloom. The forest was not abandoning her to the night. It was lighting her way. Fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a hesitant wonder, strong enough to quell the rising panic. With Rowan trotting confidently ahead, Kaelin followed the glowing trail. The tangled, thorny undergrowth began to thin. The trees grew taller and more skeletal as a dampness clung to the air. The path led them down into a sunken, misty basin where the very air seemed to hold its breath. Soon, Kaelin found herself walking along a stark line of contrast. To her right, the forest grew dense and forbidding. The trees were dark giants with bark like wrinkled iron and thorny undergrowth that clawed at the air. Rowan's hackles rose. He shied away from that side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The air drifting from those woods was cool and heavy. It carried a stern, watchful silence that made the hair on Kaelin's arms stand up. To her left, the woods seemed to sing. The trees were lighter and more graceful. Through their leaves, she caught impossible glimpses of color and light. The air that breathed from this side was warm and sweet, thick with 1,000 unnamed perfumes. Rowan's tail gave a single, hesitant wag. His ears perked up at the distant melody of birdsong and the gentle hum of unseen, joyful things. A realization struck Kaelin with a jolt. She was walking a tightrope between two different worlds. The dark woods to her right felt like Edgehaven, a fortress of judgment where every cold gaze marked her as a trespasser. The singing woods to her left resembled a festival she wasn't invited to, a paradise of life and warmth that reminded her only of what she could never have. One would cast her out, the other would ignore her. Both left her utterly alone. The hum inside her chest, that strange and private compass, urged her onward along this stark border. She pushed through a final thicket of grasping briars belonging to the stern woods, while Rowan darted nimbly around them. They passed a curtain of sweet-smelling, flowering vines reaching out from the joyful side. Then Kaelin saw it. It was barely a trail, more a suggestion of one, but it was undeniably there. A narrow track of dark, packed earth lay flanked by ancient, moss-eaten stones. The path ran straight into the forest. A silent truce kept the warring natures of the wood from overwhelming it. This path was a place of undisturbed peace. A strange sense of recognition washed over her. This path felt right. It was a road for outcasts. Rowan stepped onto the track without hesitation before turning to look back at her. His tail gave a short, decisive wag. He was ready. As Kaelin took her first step onto the track, The air shifted through the high canopy. It was a collective exhalation from the ancient trees. A sound was woven into the wind. It was the same humming melody she had heard from her cottage window, the thrumming lullaby that had called to her from the edge of the woods. It was no longer a distant echo. It was here, all around her. It was a song of deep roots and old stone, of starlight on still water, and of endless cycles of decay and rebirth. It was the soul of the forest, and it was singing the secret. Humming warmth in Kaelin's own blood surged in response. This was not a call and answer. It was a harmony, a small stream finding its way home to a great ancient river. She stopped and closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. The melody swirled closer. The breeze brushed against her ear like a physical touch, a whisper meant for her alone. Woven into the heart of the hum, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, a single note formed her name, Kaelin. Her eyes snapped open. She stood on a clear path in the heart of a darkening, living forest. She was a stranger in a land without a map, yet as the song washed through her, a sensation so powerful it made her knees weak took hold. It was a deep, resonant warmth. It was the feeling of her own roots sinking deep into the accepting earth. Tears welled in her eyes. It was the feeling of finally, truly, coming home. The forest was not just a place. It was a presence. And it knew she was there.
This is Chapter 4, The Weight of Silence.
The fire in Ilara's fireplace had died hours ago, leaving behind a mound of cold, gray ash that felt like the heart of the morning. It was a hollow dawn. The light filtering through the grimy window did not carry the promise of a new day. Instead, it was the sterile, flat light of an ended one. It crept across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air, and fell upon a small empty stool. The stool was a simple piece of wood, with 3 legs worn uneven by a lifetime of use. The seat was scarred and dark. In the stillness of the cottage, its emptiness was a physical presence, a void that seemed to pull all warmth and sound into itself. Yesterday, it had been a place of quiet questions and shared tea. It had been a sanctuary for a lonely girl finding a moment's peace in a world that offered her none. Today, it was a tombstone. Ilara stood with her back to the cold ashes. Her old bones ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with her age, and everything to do with the soul-deep exhaustion of grief. Sleep had been a stranger. It was a mercy she could not afford, a quiet pasture where the nightmare of the previous evening would surely have been waiting to graze. Instead, she had watched the moon trace its lonely arc across the sky. Each passing hour was the tick of a clock counting down to a dawn Kaelin would not see. She moved stiffly. Her usual sharp energy was replaced by a slow, methodical wade through heavy mud. The comforting chaos of her cottage offered no solace. The bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters resembled sleeping bats. The stacks of cracked leather books and jars of colored powders were now just clutter, the meaningless debris of a life that suddenly felt too long. Her hands, once sure and steady over a mortar and pestle, were now unresponsive and cold. They shook as she reached for the ceramic jar of bitter root. She didn't want the tea. The taste would be like ash in her mouth. But the simple, practiced act of making it was an anchor. It was a customary ritual in a world that had suddenly become alien. As the water began to heat, she turned to a cluttered shelf. Her fingers moved without thought, straightening a crooked fossil and adjusting a raven's feather. Her hand drifted behind a jar of dried moss, and her fingertips brushed against something small and wooden. She paused. Drawing it out, she held it in her palm. It was a bird, a tiny wren, crudely but lovingly whittled from a fallen twig. Kaelin had made it for her last week. The girl had sat on that very stool, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration as she worked the small knife. The wings were uneven, and the beak was a little too long, but the carver's affection was in every imperfect line. It was a testament to the quiet, gentle girl the village had just cast out. Ilara's throat tightened into a knot. She closed her hand around the carving, her fingers wrapping tight, forcing the sharp, unfinished edges of the wood into the wrinkled flesh of her palm. The specific pain was a welcome distraction from the vast, formless ache in her chest. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a burning path through the deep lines of her cheek. From outside, the first tentative sounds of Edgehaven's stirring began to cut through the quiet. A ragged rooster crowed in the distance, a sound of stubborn, stupid life, continuing in the face of despair. Then came the rhythmic clang of the smithy's hammer. Yesterday, it had been the heartbeat of her world. Today, it sounded hollow and accusing. Every mundane sound was a testament to a life that would go on, a life from which Kaelin had been brutally uprooted. Ilara stood frozen in the center of her small room. She was listening for the one sound she had heard almost every morning for 10 years. She wanted the soft, hesitant footfalls of a girl, coming for advice, for comfort, or for a simple cup of tea. But the path was empty. She knew with a certainty that was as cold and final as the ashes in her fireplace, that she would never hear those footsteps again. On the other side of the village, the morning air felt heavy. It was not the damp mist of early autumn, but the sterile, bone-dry scent of the gray rot. Rorik stood at the edge of his family's wheat field. His lanky frame shivered, despite the wool tunic pulled tight across his chest. Between his trembling fingers, he held a single stalk of wheat. It should have been heavy with golden grain, ready for the late harvest. Instead, it was brittle and gray. As he squeezed, it turned to a fine powder that blew away in the sluggish wind. He looked down the line of the field. Yesterday, the rot had only touched the furthest boundary fence. Overnight, it had surged forward a dozen paces. An expanding ruin cut into their livelihood, like a gray scar. She is gone, Rorik thought. The realization settled like a cold stone in his gut. The hagkin is gone. It was supposed to stop. That was what Elder Thane had promised. It was what Fing's father had shouted to the terrified crowd last night as the festival fire burned that unnatural green. They had blamed the strange girl with the watchful eyes. They had cast her into the bramble-bound to save the village. But the village was not saved. The rot was moving faster. Rorik dropped the ruined stalk and wiped the gray dust on his trousers. But the cold remained. He closed his eyes and saw Kaelin's face as the crowd closed in around her. He remembered the raw terror in her haunted gaze. He remembered the way her gaze had found his as the circle broke apart. He felt again the sickening shame of that split second, before he had looked away. Rorik had stood beside Finn. He had shouted when Finn shouted. Fear had dictated his choices. It was safer to belong to an angry crowd than to stand with the outcast. Turning his back on the ruined field, Rorik began to walk. He avoided the village square where the men were gathering to debate the blight, keeping his head low as he took the narrow, overgrown path toward the forest edge. He hesitated before Ilara's heavy oak door, listening to the suffocating silence within. Finally, summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, he raised a knuckle and tapped twice. The door swung open with an angry creak. Ilara stood there, and Rorik took a startled step back. He had expected a frail, weeping woman. Instead, he saw a monument of fury. Her waxy skin was drawn tight across her face, but her magpie eyes burned with a quiet, devastating anger. "What do you want, boy?" she rasped. Her voice was as dry as dead leaves. "Have you and Finn come to throw me into the bramble-bound too?" Rorik swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "No, Ilara. I came from the fields." He looked down, his fingers fumbling against one another. "The rot, it's worse today. It took a whole row of our wheat overnight." Alara did not look surprised. She let out a short, bitter sound that was entirely devoid of humor. "Of course it is worse. You fools cut out the only root holding the soil together. And now you wonder why the earth is crumbling." "I didn't," Rorik started, his voice cracking. He looked up, his eyes pleading. "I didn't throw her out. It was Elder Thane. I didn't say anything." Alara leaned forward, her small frame radiating an immense, crushing weight. She looked at him not as a boy, but as a symptom of the village's sickness. "And that is exactly your crime, Rorik," she said. Her voice dropped to a terrifying hiss. "Finn is cruel, but he is honest in his cruelty. You knew she was innocent. You knew it was wrong. You stood there and watched a girl be thrown to the wolves because you were too frightened to open your mouth." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The pale shame he had felt last night bloomed into a full, suffocating guilt. "She didn't cause the rot," Rorik whispered. Tears of self-disgust finally stung his eyes. "We were wrong." "I know," Alara said. Her hand gripped the edge of the door. "And the tragedy, boy, is that you knew it last night." Without another word, Alara stepped back and slammed the door. The thud cut through the stillness like a blade, leaving Rorik standing alone on the overgrown path. He stared at the closed wood as the sterile odor of the gray rot clung to the air. Edgehaven was dying. The forest was a wall of terrifying shadows. For the first time in his life, Rorik realized that silence had not made him safe. It had only made him a coward. He turned back toward the village, his hands curled into trembling fists.
This is Chapter 5, The Ashbound.
Deep within a vault of calculated stone, the silence was absolute. It did not resemble the tranquil quiet of a forest at ease. This was a heavy, artificial stillness that possessed a physical weight. Every wall had been carved from seamless blocks of obsidian, meeting at angles so sharp they seemed to slice the very air. Light did not bounce in this chamber. The dark, polished surfaces were greedy. They swallowed every stray flicker until only a suffocating, matte black remained. Time had no meaning in this lightless depth. No wind arrived to carry the scent of soil, and no water existed to carve a path through the stone. Only the order remained, frozen and perfect. In the absolute center of the chamber stood the hunter, a statue that happened to be standing. His frame was a combination of gray ash and petrified ironwood. This body was as hard as bedrock and as cold as a winter star. Breath was a forgotten luxury. The rhythm of a heartbeat had become a discarded relic of a life long forgotten. For a decade, his consciousness had remained a perfect and featureless void. He acted as a mirror that reflected only the lightless walls around him. The vault held a masterpiece of the stillness. Every line of the hunter's form was intentional. Plate by plate, his bark armor followed a mathematical symmetry that allowed for no flaw. The hunter did not feel the ache of old joints or the creeping fatigue of the soul. He was the cure for the forest's chaos, the silence that waited at the end of every song. Around him, the vault remained a tomb of measured precision. No dust danced in the air. No shadows flickered. As the anchor of this small, sterile kingdom, the hunter was a sentinel of stone, waiting for the world to stop turning. A state of unyielding pause defined his existence. A place where the only truth was a total lack of movement. He was the final breath of a dying world, held forever in a throat of ash. Even the weapon at his side was a testament to this rigid peace. It was a blade of black glass, unmoving and sharp, forged from the same obsidian as the walls. It had never been blooded. It had never been swung. It simply existed as part of the symmetry, a vertical line in a world of horizontal perfection. The hunter did not need to grip it. His fingers were already locked in a permanent stone-like grasp. He was ready for a war that he believed had already been won. He was the guardian of the great silence. The perfection did not fade. It was violently interrupted. A tremor originated in the deepest roots of the world, traveling through the bedrock until it reached the obsidian floor. The vault, which had known only a decade of absolute silence, began to hum. It was not a harmonious sound. To the logic of the stillness, this was a violent intrusion. A scream of noise that tore through the stagnant air. Suddenly, the matte black of the walls vanished. A pulse of gold and emerald light flooded the chamber. The radiance did not glow with the gentle warmth of a fire. It hit the stone like a physical impact. It was a shockwave of raw, untamed potential that stained the dark surfaces with the vibrant colors of a world the vault was built to exclude. The greedy obsidian could not swallow a light this intense. Instead, the stone began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched, piercing sound that resembled the shattering of glass. Within the center of the storm, the hunter felt the first sensation in an eternity. He did not experience it as pain. To his featureless consciousness, the magic felt like an incompatibility, a viral code attempting to overwrite his absolute suspension. For the first time in 10 years, his fingers gave a sharp, involuntary twitch. The movement was a sacrilege against the order. A dry, rasping sound followed as a hairline crack appeared in the gray ash covering his chest. Beneath that fracture, a faint and ghostly hint of a life that refused to be unwritten stirred. The noise intensified, carrying with it the frantic, joyful beat of a heart that was no longer silent. The rhythm of the Heartwood tree filled the vault. It was the song of the key, a surge of life that echoed through his very bones. The hunter's head moved. The motion was slow and mechanical, a grinding of stone joints that had forgotten how to turn. His eyes, once dull and sightless mirrors, ignited with a sudden amber flare. He did not look at the light with wonder. He looked at it with the cold, analytical focus of a predator, identifying a breach in a perimeter. The void in his mind began to fill with a single, overriding necessity. The intrusion was growing, and the silence had been broken. He was no longer a statue. He was a weapon that had been triggered. The amber flare in his eyes did not flicker. It held steady as a presence entered the featureless void of his mind. This was not a sound heard with ears. It was a sharpened thought, a cold and clinical order that originated from a height he could not comprehend. The noise of the Heartwood tree continued to batter the vault, but the internal voice was louder. It was the only truth that mattered. Words bloomed in his consciousness like frost on glass. "The balance has been violated," the thought announced. The tone lacked the heat of anger, carrying instead the weary weight of immense power and control. A lingering distortion has returned to the Heartgrove. The song is a contagion. It seeks to spread the sickness of growth back into the soil. The hunter remained motionless as the instructions were etched into his soul. Every syllable directed at his core, directing a line of logic that narrowed his world to a single point. He did not ask why the forest was considered a disease. The warmth of a forgotten sun had long since been replaced by the cold logic of the vault. To this creature of ash, the world was a complex equation that had suddenly become unbalanced. He only knew one thing. He was the correction. "The surge has a vessel," the voice continued. "Sharper now. A key has turned in the lock. Find the source of the interference. Locate the girl." A phantom image flickered in his mind. A girl with dark, watchful eyes and a hand that could make the gray earth turn green. To the hunter, she was not a person. She was a security breach. She was a surge of static that threatened the perfect peace of the great silence. "Quiet the noise," the command concluded. "Restore the stillness. Enforce the silence." the mental connection severed as abruptly as it had arrived. Only the echoes remained, vibrating within his stone-bound core. The hunter felt no fear and no hesitation. He possessed only the cold, unyielding momentum of a falling mountain. The void in his mind was gone, replaced by a map of the Elderbranch that highlighted every ripple of life magic as a target. His hand moved, with a sound like grinding bedrock. His fingers tightened around the hilt of the obsidian blade. He did not feel the weight of the weapon. He felt only the necessity of its use. The hunt had been authorized. The key would be found, and the song would be silenced forever. Grinding like tectonic plates, shifting after an age of peace, the hunter's joints protested the requirement of movement. Every step across the obsidian floor was a heavy declaration, a rhythmic thud that vibrated through the calculated stone. He moved toward the arched exit with a mechanical grace that lacked any hint of human hesitation. The vault, once a sanctuary of stillness, was now a corridor leading to a task. A jagged breach in the seamless wall stopped him. The emerald surge had done more than vibrate the air. It had fractured the very perfection of the chamber. Tucked deep within the newly formed crack, a glint of metal caught the fading light. It was a locket of tarnished silver, a circular fragment of a past that had been systematically entombed behind the stone. An elegant spiral was etched into the metal. The amber flare in his eyes flickered, then stuttered. As his gaze snagged on the tarnished silver locket, a high-pitched ringing erupted in his ears. The sound of the stillness cracking. His fingers, locked in their permanent grasp, gave a sharp and involuntary tremor. The hairline crack in the ash on his chest deepened. A soundless whisper tried to breach the silence, a name he was no longer permitted to know. A smell invaded the sterile, airless vault. It wasn't the scent of ash. It was the impossible, muddy perfume of rain on crushed leaves. The hairline fracture on his chest didn't just deepen. It split with a dry, splintering crack, shedding a fine dusting of gray ash onto the floor. His fingers, fused to the hilt of his blade, spasmed once. For a terrifying second, the hunter wasn't a weapon. He was a man whose skin was too tight, whose lungs were trying to remember how to expand against a cage of stone. Logic returned with the speed of a closing trap. The order from the Absolute exerted its pressure, smothering the flicker of recognition before it could take root. The hunter withdrew his hand. He paused. The locket was a contamination, a tool of the dissonance that had breached the vault. To leave it was to leave a flaw in the symmetry. That was the calculation his mind provided, a cold justification for an action that felt dangerously like a choice. His petrified fingers reached into the jagged breach. As they closed over the silver, the metal felt impossibly light, yet it weighed more than the obsidian blade at his side. He did not look at the spiral etching again. With a mechanical motion, he tucked the locket into the space beside his belt. His fingers shifted to the weapon at his side. He gripped the hilt of the obsidian blade, feeling the familiar weight of the glass. Preparation was complete. The task was clear. And the target was identified. He turned his back on the empty breach and stepped into the shadows of the corridor. Emerging from the lightless passage, the hunter reached the threshold. To a mundane eye, the surface might look like a normal thicket, but as he stepped through the calculated veil, the illusion dropped. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in vertical bars, a cage of light that illuminated the mosaic floor of the orderwood. There was no wind to rustle the leaves. There were no insects to disturb the air. Thousands of fallen leaves had been sorted by size and color, forming vast geometric spirals that radiated from the base of every petrified tree. This was the landscape of the Great Silence. Below the silent arches, the hunter came to a halt. Every plate of his bark armor hummed in resonance with the grove. He did not belong to the world of growth and decay. He was an extension of this rigid perfection. A vibration, distant and rhythmic, pulled at his stone-bound core. The surge from the Heartgrove was a flare in a black sky, a signal that demanded to be extinguished. He adjusted his stance, turning his head toward the west. The target was identified. The key was active. Predatory instinct replaced the clumsy requirements of human walking. The hunter moved with a silence that lacked weight, gliding between the trunks like a shadow thrown by a dying sun. He did not tire. He did not feel the resistance of the air. His path was a straight line through a world of curves, a calculated path that ignored the obstacles of the natural world. As he crossed the border where the tainted grove met the wilder forest, his boot touched a stray patch of living moss. The reaction was instantaneous. Gray frost leached the vibrant green from the plant, turning the soft growth into a brittle, ashen crust. The moss did not die, it was corrected. It crumbled into a fine powder under his heel, leaving only a gray void where life had been. The hunter vanished into the deeper shadows, leaving a trail of ash in his wake. He was no longer a prisoner of the vault. He was the enforcer of the stillness, and the hunt had truly begun.
This is Chapter 6, The Shifting Fenstones.
The neutral road of dark earth had served her well, but every path had to end. It led Kaelin out from the heavy canopy of the deep woods and left her standing at the edge of a world entirely different from the one she had known. Before her lay a wide, misty fen. Its borders were choked with towering reeds that whispered even when the air was perfectly still. Kaelin shivered as the damp air seeped into her clothes, carrying the heavy scent of algae and wet stone. A metallic tang, like the taste of rain, coated her tongue. She paused to listen, realizing the humming song of the forest had faded. In its place was a silence so deep it felt like the held breath of a watchful spirit. The path ended abruptly at the water's edge. Kaelin searched the fog for a way forward and found only a line of dark, glistening stones, snaking out into the mist. She approached the bank cautiously, her boots sinking into the marshy ground. Despair washed over her. This was not a road, it was a trap. The sensible part of her mind, the part born and bred in Edgehaven, began to scream. The stones were too far apart. The moss was as slick as grease. The fog would turn her around in 3 steps. One slip and she would be gone. The image of plunging into the cold depths while her satchel dragged her under was so vivid that she gasped. It felt like a cruel joke played by the forest on any traveler desperate enough to try it. The dangers of the woods had been abstract until now, ghosts of starvation and hidden predators. This was physical. This was a direct challenge she could see and touch. Fear was no longer a ghost. It was a wall. Rowan, however, seemed to see no wall at all. He trotted to the bank without hesitation, his paws making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching as he assessed the path ahead. With a fluid, confident motion, he gathered his strength and leaped, landing with perfect balance on the first stone. He took another easy hop to the second. From his perch, he turned back to look at Kaelin, his head cocked to one side. His tail gave a short, impatient wag. "Well, are you coming?" His simple trust was a profound challenge to her complex human fear. He did not see an impossible crossing. He saw the way forward. His intelligent gaze seemed to ask why she hesitated. Kaelin stood at the edge, a battle raging in her chest. The cold, logical voice of Edgehaven whispered of foolishness. Turn back. Find another way. Trust only what your eyes can see. But then she felt the worn weight of the wooden spiral against her skin. She remembered the forest whispering her name. She saw Rowan waiting for her, his confidence an undeniable truth. The choice was terrifying. Would she trust the fear she knew and remain a prisoner on this bank forever? Or would she trust the magic she was only just beginning to understand? Her companion, her heritage, and her own strange heart were all telling her to take the first step. The mist swirled around the bank, a living, breathing entity that seemed to mock her hesitation. From somewhere just ahead, Rowan let out an impatient whine. Kaelin's heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic drumbeat of terror. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of caution, screamed at her to retreat. But there was no retreat. Behind her lay the village that had cast her out, and the forest that offered no other path. There was no back. There was only this. Kaelin made her choice. Her fingers closed around the smooth wood of her mother's necklace, seeking a sliver of courage. The world of sight is a world of fear, she thought. Trust something else. She pushed aside the noise of Edgehaven out of her mind and focused on two tangible truths: the humming warmth against her skin and the memory of Rowan's whine cutting through the fog. One was a legacy, the other was a friend. Both were real, and both were telling her to go forward, taking a ragged breath that tasted of cold, wet air and damp earth. Kaelin lifted her foot. For a weightless, terrifying moment, she was suspended between the solid ground she knew and the impossible path she had to trust. Her boot came down. She braced for a slick slide into the cold, but her leather sole hit the stone with a solid thud. It held. She opened her eyes, her breath catching. The world had shrunk to a tiny island of dark, mossy stone in a sea of swirling gray. The bank was already a ghostly memory. All sound was muffled by the thick fog, creating a dreamlike silence broken only by the soft splash of water and the frantic beat of her own heart. She was alone, suspended in the gray. From the gloom ahead came the scratch of claws on stone. That was her only guide now. Sound and the steady vibration of the necklace. Kaelin took another step. Her nerves were electric. The second stone was slicker than the first. She flailed her arms for a moment to keep her balance, while her satchel shifted dangerously on her shoulder. The world was reduced to the immediate. She felt the yielding moss under her thin boots and the constant, clammy caress of the fog on her skin. She learned to move without seeing, trusting that the next stone would appear when she reached for it. Step, balance, breathe. The rhythm became a meditation, a mantra against the fear gnawing at her focus. Confidence grew, and with it came danger. Her movements became a fraction too quick. Her focus slipped. She leaped for a stone that looked closer than it was, and her boot landed on the very edge. Her foot slipped. A cry of terror was ripped from her throat as her body tipped sideways. The world tilted. Cold, murky water rushed over her boot, shockingly icy against her skin. For a horrifying second, she was falling. The dark water rose to claim her. Just as her balance failed completely, the thick mist gathered around her waist. It became momentarily solid. It was not a hand, but a quiet, unyielding pressure, as if the fog itself had decided she was not allowed to fall. The sensation vanished in an instant, so quick she almost thought she had imagined it. Instinct took over. Kaelin threw her weight in the opposite direction. Her free hand slapped onto the rough, slimy surface of the rock. Her fingers scrabbled for purchase, nails scraping against stone. With a desperate heave, she hauled herself back from the brink and collapsed into a trembling, gasping heap. As she lay there, cheek pressed to the slick stone, her gaze fell on the moss beneath her fingers. It was not the green slime of the other stones. This was a star-patterned growth with tiny, silvery edges. A memory surfaced, clear and sharp. Her father had once pointed to a similar patch on a river rock. "See this, little sprout? That's surefoot moss. It only grows on the oldest, most stable granite. Wherever you see that, the stone will not move." And knowledge was a solid, real thing from a life that felt a world away. Her heart was a frantic drum. The cold from her soaked leg was already seeping into her bones. The near fall had shattered her composure, and the terror returned, thick and suffocating. She felt she couldn't do it. It was impossible. But then, through the fog, she heard a soft whine. Rowan was waiting. He hadn't run ahead. The thought of his loyalty was a tiny spark in the darkness. She couldn't fail him. Pushing herself up on trembling arms, Kaelin took a shuddering breath. The fear remained, but a new, stubborn anger burned alongside it. "I will not be beaten by a line of wet stones," she vowed. Slowly, she found her footing. Her movements were careful now, stripped of all confidence but filled with a grim determination. One step, then another. The far bank appeared out of the mist with a suddenness that made her gasp. A solid, beautiful wall of green. With a final, lunging leap, her boot left the treacherous stone and landed on solid ground. She stumbled forward and collapsed onto the mossy bank, pressing her palms and her cheek against the earth. It was blessedly solid. It did not shift. It did not threaten to betray her. Her legs trembled too much to hold her weight, but here on the ground, it didn't matter. She had made it. She had passed her first test.
This is Chapter 7, The Obsidian Mirror.
As Kaelin caught her breath on the bank, the fog began to move with a strange, intentional grace. It did not drift. It pulled back from the shore like a heavy shroud being drawn away. The silence of the movement was absolute, revealing the next stage of her path. Before her lay a lake, a perfect circle of water so still and black it looked like a pool of polished obsidian. Kaelin held her breath. No birds called from the ancient trees. No leaves rustled. The air remained heavy and dead, swallowing sound until the thud of her own pulse was a drum in her ears. It felt like a sacred, terrible wound in the heart of the forest. The strength that had carried her across the stones evaporated, leaving a dry, raging thirst in its place. Her throat felt as if it were filled with sand. She looked at the water. The silence carried a warning, yet the lake appeared clean and inviting. "It is just water," she told herself. Letting exhaustion overrule her caution. The trial was the stones. This is the reward. Rowan watched warily from the tree line, but Kaelin ignored him and walked over the smooth, dark pebbles to the shore. She knelt, the stones firm beneath her knees. "The ordeal is over," she whispered like a prayer. "This is my reward." Leaning forward, she cupped her hands to break the glassy surface and scoop up the water. She stopped. Her hands froze inches from the surface. There was no reflection. Where her face should have been, there was only a black, bottomless void. It was like staring into a pane of smoked glass that refused to show the world before it. A cold shock pierced through her weariness. Something was wrong. Before she could pull away, the water began to swirl. A patch directly beneath her gaze turned, moved by an invisible current. An image rose from the inky depths. As it formed, a numbing cold seeped up from the pebbles. A chill that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the sorrow in the water. A man's face formed on the surface. His features were gaunt, his beard a matted mess. A wild, lost light burned in his eyes. He was clawing at the empty dirt of a barren clearing, his movements driven by a hunger that had consumed his mind. The image was so vivid that Kaelin could almost feel the ache of his starvation in her own belly. Then the vision dissolved back into blackness. Kaelin scrambled back, a gasp trapped in her throat. The lake was not finished. Before the man had fully vanished, he was replaced by a weeping woman, her despair a physical weight. Then came a warrior staring at a broken sword, followed by a scholar with his books in ruins. It was a rapid, suffocating gallery of every way a soul could break in this forest. Kaelin understood the lake's intent. This was not a random display. It was an argument. "See," the water seemed to whisper. "This is the end. This is what the Elderbranch does to your kind. Surrender now." The final image fractured Kaelin's world. The face that formed was young. It was a girl with dark hair tangled with twigs and leaves. A mirror of Kaelin herself. She was not screaming. She was simply sitting, staring into nothing. Her eyes as empty and still as the lake. All the fight and all the hope had been extinguished, leaving only a hollow shell. The lake was showing Kaelin her fate. The silence was broken by a choked sound of terror. Kaelin recoiled from the water's edge, scrambling backward over the pebbles until her back hit the solid trunk of a tree. Her thirst was gone, replaced by a fear that went deeper than bone. The physical peril of the stones was nothing compared to this threat to her soul. She stared at the black, knowing water, and truly understood the terrifying scale of what she was facing. Kaelin pressed her back against the rough bark. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The image of the hollow-eyed girl remained fixed in her mind, a premonition of her own end. Before her, the Stillmere lay heavy with the memory of the horrors it had shown. It had done its work. Fear was no longer a physical threat. It was a spiritual chill trying to seep into her very bones. She understood the lake's purpose. It was a silent judge, laying out the evidence of failure. "See how all the others have ended?" the water seemed to whisper. "See how hope dies here? Why struggle? Surrender." A primal urge to flee surged through her. She wanted to run back into the fog and hide in the deep woods where she wouldn't have to face this truth. It would be so easy to turn away. She could let the despair win and become another lost soul wandering the Elderbranch until she faded into nothing. Ilara's voice acted as an anchor in the panic. "Do not let their fear become your own." Kaelin had faced the fear of the village, but this was different. This was the forest's fear, the collected despair of all who had come before. It was a far greater test. How do you fight despair? She thought. Her mind returned to her survival on the Fenstones. She hadn't fought the rocks or the fog. She had closed her eyes and trusted. The lake was showing her everything that could be seen. But what if the answer was in what lay beneath? A cold anger ignited beneath her ribs. It was a stubborn defiance aimed at the lake's cruel argument. She hated the thought of her own spirit ending up as empty as the girl in the water. "No," she thought. "You can show me their ghosts, but you will not make me one of them." Her resolve, once a fragile thing, hardened. She pushed herself away from the tree and forced her legs to carry her back to the water's edge. Rowan watched with a worried stillness, but he did not move to stop her. This was her battle to fight. Kaelin stood over the black water. The visions began to swirl again as the lake sensed her return. The gaunt face of the starving man began to form. This time, Kaelin did not recoil. She stared through the ghost, her gaze becoming a physical force. She poured every ounce of her stubborn will and every drop of her grief into that single, unbroken stare. The lake wanted her to see herself in the dead man's eyes. "Your story is not mine," she thought. Her will was an unbreakable shield. She was not denying his fate. She was simply refusing to accept it as her own. She held the stare. The air grew tense. The silence of the Stillmere deepened until it felt as though the world were waiting for a verdict. Slowly, the dark water shimmered. The image of the starving man wavered and dissolved. The weeping woman appeared, and Kaelin's unyielding gaze broke her apart too. One by one, she met the ghosts in the water. She fought them not with magic or strength, but with a refusal to be broken. Finally, the lake was still. Kaelin stared into the black void. Her heart pounded. Then the surface changed. A flicker of light appeared. Her own reflection started to form. It was faint at first, like a sketch in the dirt. Then it gained substance and sharpened until it was as clear as polished steel. The face looking back was pale and streaked with mud, haunted by what it had seen. But the eyes were not hollow. They were her own, and they were burning with a new, hard-won fire.
This is Chapter 8, The Sanctuary of Lies.
The Stillmere had left Kaelin with a sharp, hard-won clarity, but her physical strength had failed. Beyond the tree line, she discovered a clean stream. She drank until the cold numbed her throat, and then allowed her body to give way. She collapsed into a bed of damp moss, surrendering to a fitful, dreamless sleep. The sun was low in the sky when she forced her weary limbs to move again. Leaving the black shore behind, she found the path forward had changed. It was no longer a track of earth. A raised boardwalk of weathered planks wound through a forest of misty reeds. Kaelin stepped onto the wood, unaware she was walking the ghost-light walk. The air here felt heavy, a gathering of mist and silence. Exhaustion became a physical weight. Every step on the damp planks sent a dull ache through Kaelin's bones, and her muscles felt heavy and slow. The clarity she had found at the lake remained, but it was housed in a failing frame. The spiritual cold of the Stillmere had faded, replaced by an older, more primal dread. The fear of the dark and the things that hunted within it. Kaelin needed shelter. She needed a place to wait out the blind hours of the night, but the grove offered no refuge. The gnarled trunks of oak and ironwood rose like pillars in a forgotten temple. Their canopy was a thick vault that swallowed the remaining light. As the air turned cool, the rhythmic chirping of 1,000 crickets filled the woods. The sound only served to heighten the immense, pressing silence of the trees. She felt small, a fragile thing in a world of giants. The courage she had found at the shore was beginning to unravel. Then the lights arrived. At first, they were only faint sparks at the edge of her sight. Glints so brief, she mistook them for a tremor in her vision. She had seen them on her first night in the wood, but had convinced herself they were just ghosts born of the dark. Now, as the shadows thickened, they returned with a quiet confidence. A single orb of soft blue light pulsed by the roots of a great oak. Another, a brilliant white, bloomed in the air beside it. Soon, they were everywhere. Hundreds of shimmering lights danced in the gloom, hovering above the misty water on either side of the boardwalk. They wove between the ancient trunks in silent, swaying patterns. They moved like a slow swarm of fireflies. Their glow cast a luminescence that transformed the menacing grove into a landscape of silver and sapphire. It was as if a handful of stars had been caught in the branches and were now trying to dance their way free. For a long moment, Kaelin forgot her exhaustion. She forgot the dread. Her senses were full of a breathless awe. It is a gift. A dangerous thought whispered in the cold hollow of her mind. The forest had guided her with the moss. Surely this was another sign, a reward for surviving the lake. The thought was seductive. It was so welcome that she gripped it with everything she had left. Rowan was immune to the spectacle. He moved with a rigid tension, his belly nearly brushing the damp planks of the boardwalk. A vibration thrummed in his chest, a low, constant note of distrust. He did not look at the beauty of the lights. Instead, he tracked each one as a hunter tracks an arrow, his eyes darting with a frantic, lethal precision. Kaelin was a needle caught between two magnets. Her exhausted frame pleaded for the rest the lights promised, but Rowan's suspicion acted as an anchor. It was a pressure in her chest she could not ignore. The lesson of the Stillmere remained. Beauty in this wood was often a veil for a jagged truth. The shimmering lights began to gather ahead. They swirled together until their combined glow carved a path through the reeds, leading away from the rotting boardwalk. They bobbed in a rhythmic dance.
It was a silent invitation to find safety. Kaelin hesitated.
She watched the glowing trail while the warning of her only friend vibrated in the air. One pull offered an end to the biting cold. The other warned of a predator's trap. Caught between a desperate hope and a cold certainty, she took a single wary step forward. The path revealed by the dancing lights was deceptively smooth. It was a trail of moss that seemed to wait for her footsteps, leading her away from the boardwalk and into a small clearing of firm ground. In the center, the lights swirled together. Their individual sparks merged until they formed a single, heartening sight, a campfire. The creation was flawless. The light was no longer the spectral blue of the moats. It had become a rich, inviting orange that crackled around a stack of dry logs. A protective ring of heat pushed back the freezing shadows of the wood. Kaelin heard the rhythmic snap of burning timber and felt a more potent lure. The rich, savory scent of roasting meat. Kaelin's stomach tightened with a sharp, hollow ache. She had not eaten since Alara's honeycakes that morning. The weight of her journey suddenly felt unbearable. The scent was intoxicating, offering everything her frame craved: heat for her skin and relief for her hunger. The wall of her caution, eroded by hours of struggle, finally collapsed. This must be real, she thought. This is my reward. Kaelin moved toward the clearing. Every instinct pulled her toward the light, like a physical tether. Rowan, however, planted his feet. The vibration in his chest grew louder, a resonant, demanding warning. When she tried to step around him, he pressed his weight against her leg and gripped the hem of her trousers in his teeth. He was a physical anchor against the tide of her desperation. "Rowan, stop," she whispered. Her voice was thin. "It is a fire. We need it." The dog ignored her. He pulled again, his growl unwavering. The refusal acted as a bucket of ice over her feverish desire. She looked from his bristling form to the perfect campfire, and a memory from the black shore returned. The still, obsidian surface of the lake, just before the ghosts had appeared. It had looked perfect, too. Kaelin realized the trap. The forest gave tests, but it never gave gifts. A chill hit her that had nothing to do with the night air. This was not a mercy, it was a noose. With a choked sound of disappointment, Kaelin forced herself to turn away from the promise of warmth. Her stomach knotted in protest. Every muscle pleaded for her to return to the heat, but she trusted Rowan. She trusted the lesson the still mirror had carved into her mind. Kaelin and Rowan pressed on, leaving the phantom heat of the campfire behind. The true path was now a ghost of its former self. She was forced back onto the rickety boardwalk, where the timber groaned under her weight. The only reliable light came from the north side of the ancient trees, a humble emerald moss that provided a faint, steady glow. The shimmering lights, however, were not finished with their games. The lights swirled ahead, weaving a new and more heartbreaking lure. Nestled between the massive roots of two towering oaks stood the image of a small, sturdy cottage. It was built from dark timber and weathered fieldstone, exactly like the homes in Edgehaven. A plume of cedar-scented smoke curled lazily from the chimney, rising toward the dark canopy. Warm, honeyed light flooded from the windows, promising a soft mattress and a solid roof. The illusion was so detailed that Kaelin could almost feel the dry heat of a hearth on her skin. She heard the distant, muffled melody of a fiddle, a tune that spoke of festivals and safety. It was an image of everything she had ever lost. It was a vision of a home where she belonged. This temptation was a jagged ache that pierced deeper than her hunger. It was a snare for her heart rather than her stomach. Kaelin stopped, her fingers clutching the wooden necklace until the spiral bit into her palm. A storm of longing rose within her, making it hard to breathe. Rowan's low growl remained a constant, steady reminder of the truth. This was a lie. It was a cruel and beautiful deception. Kaelin closed her eyes, shutting out the amber light of the windows and the scent of the wood smoke. Her resolve had been tested at the shore, and now it began to solidify. She understood the nature of the trial. The Elderbranch was dissecting her, preying on every basic human need: food, warmth, and shelter. To pass, she had to abandon her desires. She had to refuse the comfort she craved. When she opened her eyes again, Kaelin refused to look at the inviting glow of the cottage. Her gaze dropped to the rotting planks of the boardwalk. She searched for the pale, honest light of the moss. That had been her first guide. It was the only light she would trust. She would ignore the lies, no matter how bright. She would follow the truth, no matter how dim. Kaelin kept her eyes fixed on the mossy planks of the boardwalk. Her world had shrunk to a narrow circle of awareness. The shimmering lights flickered at the edges of her vision, but she refused to give them her attention. Her focus remained on the true path, a faint trail marked by the humble emerald glow of the moss. It offered no comfort and no promises. It offered only the truth of the way forward. Rowan trotted beside her. The low vibration in his chest had settled now that she had listened to his warning. A grim certainty began to harden in Kaelin's heart. The forest was testing her, stripping away every mortal desire to see what remained. She had refused the lure of food and the promise of a solid roof. She thought she had understood the nature of the trial. The Elderbranch, however, held a more predatory deception in reserve. The shimmering lights gathered on the path ahead. They swirled together until their blue and white sparks merged into a single golden luminescence. It was not the orange heat of the fire or the yellow glow of the cottage. This was a gentler light. It was familiar and dear. It took shape. Standing in a pool of warm light was the perfect image of Alara. Kaelin halted. Her forward momentum died as her heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. It was her. Every detail was exquisitely correct. The stooped shoulders, the familiar patched shawl, and the face wrinkled like a dried apple. It was the eyes that broke Kaelin's resolve. They were Alara's bright, observant magpie eyes, filled with an expression of profound relief. The phantom smiled. The gesture was a physical blow. Then the illusion spoke. The voice was a perfect echo of the raspy warmth that had been the only consistent comfort in Kaelin's life. "Kaelin, child, thank the spirits I found you." The phantom Alara stepped forward, reaching out a hand in a beckoning gesture. "I was so worried. I followed as far as my old bones would carry me. This way, child. I have found a hollow sheltered from the wind where we can rest." This was not a lure for her body. It was an arrow aimed at the softest part of her soul. Her loneliness and her grief rose up in an overwhelming wave. She didn't think of logic or sigils. She only felt a desperate, childlike need. She wanted this to be real. She wanted the isolation to end. The urge to run into that embrace was a tearing ache in her chest. Tears blurred the image of the old woman. Kaelin stood paralyzed. Her feet felt rooted to the wood, while her heart felt as though it were being pulled apart. It would be so easy to believe. It would be so easy to surrender to this one beautiful hope. Rowan's growl returned. It was low and sharp, a blade of sound cutting through her emotional storm. He pressed his weight against her leg, acting as a solid grounding anchor. His warning was the only truth she had left. Kaelin closed her eyes, letting the hot tears spill down her cheeks. She couldn't look at that kind, lying face any longer. Her fingers clutched the necklace at her throat. Its steady heat was a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her own heart. She forced herself to think. She tried to remember Alara's real voice. The real Alara was leagues behind her. her strength spent by the village gate. The real Alara possessed a magic of roots and wisdom, not the power to craft golden illusions in the deep woods. This was a ghost, a memory used as a weapon. It was the hardest truth she had ever faced. With a sob torn from the core of her being, Kaelin turned her back on the phantom of her dearest friend. She forced her stiffened limbs to move, stepping away from the golden light and back onto the moss-lit path. Each step was a physical agony. Kaelin, the illusion called. The voice was no longer warm. It was laced with a pained, heartbreaking confusion. "Child, where are you going? Do not leave me alone out here." The words were a final, vicious twist of the knife. Kaelin squeezed her eyes shut and walked on, refusing to look back. Behind her, the golden light flickered and wavered. With a soft, sighing sound, the image dissolved into a swarm of cold sparks that scattered into the darkness. She continued her journey with a heart that felt bruised and broken. The tears still streamed down her face, but she did not stop. She walked with a new certainty, one forged in the fires of her own heartbreak. She had learned the harshest lesson of the Elderbranch. The most beautiful promises were often the most dangerous traps.
This is Chapter 9, The Hungry Hush.
A phantom of Alara had vanished into the night, but the ache of its false promise remained. It was a lingering pain in Kaelin's chest. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving tight tracks in the grime of her face. There was no room for sorrow now. It had been burned away, leaving behind a core of weary determination. The forest had shown its capacity for cruel lies. She would not be fooled again. She followed the true path, guided by the humble emerald glow of the moss. Every step was a small victory against the heartbreak that trailed her like a shadow. Rowan stayed close. The earlier tension in his frame had vanished, replaced by a quiet companionship. He seemed to understand she had passed a critical test, yet a new stillness fell over him. He no longer sniffed the air for threats. He appeared to be listening to a silence only he could hear. The boardwalk descended. It was a gentle decline that led into a shallow, bowl-shaped clearing. The timber ended, sinking into the damp earth. Before Kaelin lay a sunken glade, cloaked in a thick, motionless mist. Large, skeletal trunks of ancient trees loomed like monuments to forgotten things. This was the Fograve Hollow. The great trees ringed the edge and leaned inward, their branches interlocking overhead like the latticed roof of a gray cathedral. As she descended, the air altered. The cool atmosphere of the night was replaced by an unnatural, penetrating cold. It was a damp, heavy chill that ignored her clothes and seeped into her skin. The cold seemed to emanate from the very ground. A thick, low-lying fog rose from the hollow's floor. It was as white as bone. It did not drift or swirl like the mist of the fen. It rose in a silent, inexorable tide. The vapor swirled around Kaelin's ankles, and then her calves. It was cold and weightless. It was like wading into a river of ghosts. Then the second warning arrived. It was far more unnerving than the cold. The world began to go quiet. The constant, familiar chirping of crickets had been the soundtrack to her night. Now it began to fade. It wasn't that the insects had stopped their song. It was as if the sound itself were being absorbed and smothered by the rising fog. The sound waves were being trapped and erased before they could reach her ears. Kaelin stopped. A prickling chill ran up her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She cocked her head and listened. The rustle of her trousers was muted and distant. The soft thud of her boots on the earth had vanished. She looked at Rowan. He walked beside her, but his paws made no sound on the leafy ground. He was a silent phantom, a moving shape in a world where noise was being systematically erased. The silence was not peaceful. It was hungry. It was a presence in itself, an active force that was devouring the sounds of the living world. The path ended at the bottom of the hollow, in the heart of the fog. The white sea was now up to Kaelin's waist. The world behind her was a muffled memory. The world ahead was a place of absolute, profound, and unnatural silence. She hesitated at the edge of the deepest part of the hollow. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. This was a different kind of magic. The shimmering lights had been a test of her desires. This felt older and more fundamental. The lights had asked, "What do you want?" She had a terrible feeling this place was about to ask, "What are you?" The last trial had sought to break her heart. This one was here to claim her soul. There was no path to follow now. There was only the certainty that the heart of the trial lay ahead in the deepest part of the hollow. Kaelin drew a breath that felt thin and useless. She took a single, deliberate step forward, leaving the relative safety of the slope behind to enter the hollow. The bone-white fog rose to meet her. It was not a gentle swirling, but a sudden, engulfing wave. The vapor surged past her waist and over her shoulders. In an instant, the world vanished. She was enveloped. Then everything else disappeared. First went the sound. Silence was no longer an absence of noise. It became an absolute, active presence. Kaelin could not hear the swish of her own clothes as she moved. She could not hear the thud of her boots on the ground. She strained her ears for an anchor and realized with a wave of terror that she could no longer hear her own breathing. Even the drum of her heart had been silenced. It was like being plunged 1,000 feet beneath the sea, but infinitely more profound. This was a silence that did not just surround her, it invaded her. Next went the scent. The rich, complex perfume of the elderbranch was gone. The smell of damp earth and the sharp tang of pine were erased in a single stroke. They were replaced by a sterile nothingness. It was like trying to breathe in a vacuum. The air was so empty that it seemed to steal the very memory of scent from her mind. Finally, the feeling of the world dissolved. The weight of the satchel on her shoulder faded, until Kaelin could no longer be sure it was there. The damp caress of the fog vanished, leaving her with no sense of temperature or air. The texture of her woolen tunic and the solid ground beneath her feet slipped away. All of it melted into a sense of disembodiment. She could not feel the world, and she was beginning to lose the feeling of herself within it. Kaelin was adrift in a featureless white void. There was no up or down, no before or after. There was only this silent, textureless, and endless moment. It was a place of total sensory deprivation, a prison designed to sever every connection to the physical world. It was meant to destroy every anchor that told a person they were real. Into that perfect emptiness, a new sensation began to seep. It was a spiritual cold, a chill that bypassed her skin and sank directly into her soul. It carried a silent, utterly convincing whisper. This was not a sound she heard with her ears, but a truth that bloomed fully formed in her mind. You are nothing. You are alone. There is no one and nothing else. The lie was absolute. It was the fundamental truth of the void. In a place with no sight, no sound, and no touch, Kaelin had no way to prove she existed. The memories of Rowan, Alara, and the forest itself began to feel like fantasies concocted by a mind that was no longer there. She stood frozen in the heart of the nothingness, a solitary consciousness on the verge of dissolving. The ultimate lie was taking root. It was a smothering, weightless hush that began to bind her spirit. Panic began to rise like a helpless scream in a world that had no sound. The silent scream of Kaelin's panic had no echo. It was swallowed by the nothingness, another texture erased from existence. Her sense of self was a concept built on a lifetime of touch and sound. Now it was a failing signal, an ink drop dissolving in a storm. The insidious whisper, "You are nothing," was no longer a suggestion. It was becoming her reality. Her memories were thin, half-forgotten dreams. Rowan's warmth, Ilara's embrace. Her own face in the dark water. All of them were losing their substance against the overwhelming truth of the void. This was the ultimate test of her spirit. With no external world to push against, she was forced completely, terrifyingly inward. The temptation to let go was a physical pressure. It would be so easy to surrender. She could sit down in the featureless white and allow the fading echoes of her consciousness to dissipate. She could accept the absolute loneliness and let the belief that she was nothing become true. Despair, cold and final, threatened to consume what little was left. Kaelin was on the verge of being extinguished. A thought, a feeling, a person about to be unwritten. Then something flickered. It was not a light she saw, but the memory of a sensation. A jolt. She felt again the slick, treacherous surface of a Fenstone under her boot. The heart-stopping lurch as she slipped. The icy shock of the water. The desperate, scraping grip of her fingers on the rock as she hauled herself back from the brink. The memory was visceral. It cut through the numbness like a jagged blade. It was a memory of struggle. It was a memory of survival. Another flicker followed, the dark, unbroken surface of the Stillmere. She saw again the gallery of defeated faces. Then, her own reflection appeared, pale and weary, but with eyes that burned. It was a memory of defiance. It was a memory of will. A final, aching memory surfaced. The kind, smiling face of the phantom Ilara. Kaelin felt again the tearing pain of turning her back on that beautiful lie. It was a memory of heartbreak, but more than that, it was a memory of choice. These were not just thoughts. They were proofs. They were the scars on her soul that testified to her existence. The Fenstones proved she had a body that could fight. The Stillmere proved she had a will that could endure. The ghost lights proved she had a heart that could choose truth over comfort. She was not nothing. She was the sum of her scars and her choices. Kaelin did not fight the void. That was its trap. To push against nothingness was to invite the nothingness in. Instead, she let it be. She accepted its silent presence. And then, in a world that lacked sight, she closed her eyes. It was a symbolic act of pure intent. She turned all of her focus inward. She searched past the despair and the loneliness for the one thing the hollow could not touch. She found it, a tiny, flickering ember of warmth in a universe of absolute cold. It was the feeling of her own presence. It was the faint, thrumming heat of the necklace against her chest. This was the light within. She held that tiny flame, shielding it from the emptiness. She nurtured it with her proofs. The defiance at the lake was the fuel. The choice in the grove was a breath. The survival on the stones gave it substance. The ember did not erupt into a great fire. It simply stabilized. It grew from a flicker to a small, steady glow. A single point of color in the white nothing. It was her. It was Kaelin. Her inner light held steady. It was a quiet act of rebellion. The void could not consume what refused to be nothing. She felt the ghost of a heartbeat return to her chest. It was slow and steady. A single, defiant rhythm in a world that had none. In response, the silence broke. It was not a crash, but a low, deep thrumming in the distance. Kaelin recognized the sound. It vibrated in harmony with her necklace and her soul. The bone-white fog began to thin, revealing the dark, solid shapes of the great trees at the edge of the hollow. The cold receded, replaced by the cool, familiar air of the forest night. It was the sound of the Heartgrove. It was calling her home.
This is Chapter 10. The Heartgrove Awakens.
Kaelin emerged from the fading echoes of the foggrave like a swimmer breaking the surface for air. The bone-white mist dissolved behind her. Its profound silence was shattered by a sound so The sound was a constant vibration that resonated in the air and in the ground beneath her feet. Kaelin felt it. It was a low, powerful note, a slow heartbeat that acted as the life pulse of the world. It called to a place deep within her that she had never known existed. Her spirit, steeled by the trials of the night, recognized the sound as a destination. Her body, however, remained a vessel of mortal limits. She ached with a profound weariness. As she walked, the forest began to change. The transformation was so complete that it burned away the last of her exhaustion. The grim, testing nature of the fen had vanished. This place was different. The humble moss that had been her only guide now flared with a brilliant, confident light. It was no longer just a path. The glow spread outward, forming a winding trail of luminous flora, vines and impossible flowers that changed from soft blue to a welcoming gold as she approached. These were the blooming veins, a living network guiding her to the heart. The trees were no longer silent giants. They seemed to lean inward as she passed, their ancient branches lifting to clear her way in a gesture of profound respect. The air had been transformed. The damp chill of the hollow was gone, replaced by a nourishing warmth. The grove was thick with 1,000 new scents, rich soil, night-blooming petals, and the clean promise of running water. The hostile atmosphere of the outer woods had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of ancient peace. This was not just another part of the forest. This was a sanctuary. Kaelin walked in a state of quiet awe. Her fear and her grief seemed to lift from her shoulders, held at bay by the undeniable magic of the grove. Her heart had been a tight, guarded fist for as long as she could remember. Now it began to unclench. She was a pilgrim who had finally reached the sacred city. Even Rowan had changed. The watchful guard dog was gone. He walked beside her with an easy gait, his nose twitching with curiosity rather than suspicion. His tail gave a few gentle wags. As they reached the inner circle, he lowered his head for a moment in a gesture that looked impossibly like a bow. A soft sound of recognition escaped his throat. He, too, recognized this place. He knew they had arrived somewhere truly special. The blooming veins led them onward. With every step, the thrumming heartbeat of the grove grew more insistent. It was no longer a background vibration. It was a melodic hum that pulled Kaelin forward. It was a song of welcome that promised answers to questions she hadn't yet learned how to ask. The path wound through a quiet copse of ancient trees whose leaves rustled in a soft murmur. Faint whispers drifted from the grove of echoes, telling stories in a language just beyond her understanding. As she pushed past the last of the willows, the trees opened up. The thrumming sound swelled into an all-encompassing song. Kaelin stood at the edge of a large, circular clearing. In its center, she saw the source. Kaelin stepped from the shadows of the willows and into the clearing. Her breath was lost in a silent rush of awe. The source of the deep, humming song that had filled her soul was not a creature or a place. It was impossibly both. In the absolute center of the sanctuary stood the Heartwood tree. It was a thing of impossible scale. The tree defied every mortal notion of what nature should be. Its base was a colossal marriage of dark, primordial stone and gnarled, living wood. The trunk was so wide it would have taken her a dozen paces just to walk past it. The roots, thick as a man's waist, were not buried in the earth, but seemed to be the earth, great, stony knuckles rising from the ground before plunging back into the deep soil. Arranged in a wide circle around the base stood a ring of massive, moss-covered monoliths. Each was etched with faint, spiraling patterns. She had found the Packstone circle. From this monumental base, The trunk rose into the night sky, a pillar connecting the world to the heavens. It was not simple wood. Patches of the surface were like polished granite, while others were covered in a thick, living bark that seemed to flow with a slow, ancient life. Its highest branches were lost in the darkness above, forming a canopy that appeared to scrape the stars. It was less a tree and more a mountain that had found the will to grow leaves. A great, jagged crack ran down its side, a wound of immense age. It looked as if the tree had been struck by a bolt of lightning forged in the heart of a dying sun millennia ago. The edges of the scar were blackened and smooth. From deep within the breach, a wounded light pulsed. It was a soft, golden luminescence that beat in perfect time with the thrumming song that filled the air. This was the forest's own slow, powerful heartbeat. Kaelin felt an overwhelming urge to approach, a pull that was both deeply personal and profoundly ancient. She walked forward. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet of glowing moss. Rowan followed her to the edge of the monoliths, but went no further. He sat on his haunches, just outside the ring of ancient stones, understanding this was a step she had to take alone. The air around the tree was thick with a palpable weight. It was a vibrant tension that made the hair on Kaelin's arms stand on end and her skin tingle. This was a place where the veil between worlds had worn thin. As she drew closer, the necklace grew hot against her chest. It was no longer a gentle, comforting heat. It was a vibrant, living warmth. The wooden spiral began to vibrate, a perfect, tiny echo of the great tree's resonant hum. This was it. The recognition was not a thought, but a certainty. This was the Heartgrove. It was the source of the whisper that had called to her from the edge of the world. It was the destination her parents had sought, the place they had spoken of in hushed tones. This was the heart of everything. She stood before the colossal trunk, a small, insignificant creature in the presence of something eternal. The sheer scale of the tree made her own life feel like a single leaf in a vast forest. The trials of the night had led her here. The stones, the lake, the illusions, and the void. They had been the keys. This was the lock. With a hand that trembled with a profound and sacred awe, Kaelin reached out. Her fingers brushed against the strange, stone-like bark. It was not cold like rock, nor was it warm like living wood. It was both, a fusion of life and endurance. It pulsed with the same deep, rhythmic beat that now thrummed through her entire body. The moment her fingertips made contact, the deep hum of the tree surged up her arm. It was a jolt of pure life, taking a final, shuddering breath. She pressed her palm flat against the surface. The world dissolved. The thrumming psalm exploded into a deafening roar. The golden light became a blinding, absolute white. The scent of the forest, the feeling of the ground, and the very sense of her own body vanished in a total sensory explosion. Her consciousness was ripped from its moorings. Kaelin was plunged headfirst into the raging, chaotic river of the Heartwood soul. There was no transition, no gentle slide into a dream. One moment, Kaelin was a girl with her hand pressed against the bark. The next, she was pure consciousness adrift in an ocean of raw, untranslated power. The experience lacked a narrative. It was a chaotic, simultaneous flood of sight, sound, and feeling. 1,000 years of memory and magic poured into her mind in a single, shattering instant. Sound arrived first. A roar of 1,000 voices that lacked the structure of words. She heard the deep, grinding speech of stone and the whispering song of ancient leaves. The sharp, snapping crackle of fire wrestled with the fluid, murmuring tongue of water. Woven through this elemental symphony were human voices. Dozens of them surged from the past, speaking in a language Kaelin had never heard, yet understood with a certainty that settled directly in her soul. Resonant phrases echoed in the storm, a solemn vow to keep the balance, a desperate warning against a stillness that consumes, and the names of ancient spirits, Wisphwhirl, Ashroot, and the Sentinel, spoken with a mixture of ancient respect and fear. Sight followed as a barrage of fragmented, burning images flashed against the canvas of her mind. Abstract symbols blazed into existence before fading back into the dark. These were the 9 sigils. She saw a spiral etched in a tree ring, a flickering flame held in the cradle of a leaf, and a perfect circle cracked through its center. They were more than mere pictures. They were fundamental laws, concepts so potent they possessed a physical weight. Faces flickered in the storm, too quick to grasp yet impossible to forget. She saw her parents. They were younger then. Their faces were not filled with the fear she remembered, but with a hard-won determination as they pressed their own hands to this very tree. Other faces followed, men and women from ages past. Their clothes were strange, and their features weathered by suns she had never seen, but their eyes all held the same look of solemn duty. They have my mother's eyes, Kaelin realized with a jolt that cut through the chaos. This was her lineage. They were the Pactkeepers. The vision sharpened, focusing on the Heartwood tree itself. She saw it in its prime, whole and unscarred, blazing with a light so powerful it acted as a sun in the heart of the forest. Then came the catastrophe. A wave of darkness arrived, a creeping, orderly silence that was not an absence of sound, but an active, consuming force. She watched the great crack form on the trunk. It was not caused by lightning, but by an internal, spiritual agony as the tree fought to contain the encroaching void. The brilliant light dimmed, fading to the wounded pulse she had seen in the clearing. But it was the feeling that truly broke her. Kaelin felt the immense, joyful power of the Pact at its creation, a perfect, harmonious chord struck between the mortal and the spirit worlds. Then came the crushing, discordant sorrow of its breaking. It was a wound that echoed through every root and leaf of the Elderbranch. She felt the deep, abiding pain of the wounded tree, a constant, weary ache that had lasted for centuries. Through the flood of history, the forest's ancient consciousness turned its full attention upon her. This was not a passive watchfulness. It was an active, probing intelligence. It sifted through her memories, her fears, and her smallest hopes. It recognized the blood in her veins. It acknowledged the shape of her spirit and the potential that lay dormant within her, in the silence of her mind. The tree gave her a title that resonated with the force of a great bell, the key, the seed of renewal. The influx of power was too much. Her mortal mind was a tiny vessel overflowing with a river of raw history. It was a beautiful and terrible agony to be connected to everything and simultaneously ripped apart by it. Just as her consciousness reached its breaking point, the vision ended. The roar of 1,000 voices became the quiet hum of the grove. The blinding white light returned to a gentle golden pulse. The feeling of being everywhere collapsed into the sharp, specific sensation of her own body. Kaelin was thrown back, stumbling away from the tree as if from a physical blow. She landed hard on the mossy ground. Air fled her lungs. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind, a storm of phantom sounds and burning images. Then a wet nose nudged her cheek. Rowan was there, his one good eye wide with a protective worry. He licked the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. He was her anchor, a tangible piece of loyalty in a world that had just dissolved into eternity and back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with the overwhelming aftershock of the vision. She was just an outcast from a small village, yet she had just shared a breath with the timeless, and it had looked back at her and called her by name. Kaelin lay on the soft, glowing moss, Her chest felt tight as she dragged air back into her lungs. The world swam back into focus, a dizzying kaleidoscope of emerald and gold. The chaotic symphony of the vision still echoed in her mind. She felt scoured hollow, remade, as if every part of her had been dismantled and reassembled in an unfamiliar shape. Slowly, she pushed herself into a sitting position. Her limbs trembled with a mixture of exhaustion and an ancient, resonant energy. She looked up at the Heartwood tree and the breath caught in her throat. The ancient wood had changed. The light pulsing from the great wounded breach was no longer a faint flicker. It had become a steady, healthy golden glow that pushed back the shadows of the clearing. It was still a heartbeat, but it was the beat of a heart beginning to heal. Her touch and her connection to the Pact had provided the spark the tree required to kindle a new flame. The surge of life did not go unnoticed. A signal rippled out from the tree and into the very stones of the sanctuary. It began with a low, deep, grinding sound. The noise carried a sense of immense tension, the sound of a mountain shifting on its foundations. Kaelin's eyes darted around the clearing. She saw nothing but the great trees and the moss-covered boulders scattered among the packed stone circle. These rocks had been silent witnesses to the ages, but now one of them moved. The largest boulder, a colossal stone covered in a thick blanket of moss and lichens, began to unfold. With the sound of stone grating on stone, the breaches in the rock widened to reveal hidden joints. A section of the stone lifted, revealing a massive limb of twisted, petrified wood. Another shifted to become a thick, stony leg. The moss and lichens were not a covering, they were a living hide. The boulder was a guardian waking from a slumber so deep it had become one with the earth. The sentinel had been sleeping in the hollow of still roots, a chamber deep beneath the clearing, until Kaelin's awakening of the Heartwood called it forth. The creature rose to its full height, a colossus of living rock and ancient iron-hard timber. It was the oak sentinel. The great protector had waited centuries for a sign. Kaelin was that sign. A wood and stone colossus turned its head with a slow, deliberate movement that possessed the gravity of ages. Its face was a mask of bark and granite. 2 points of light ignited deep within its features, eyes like pools of glowing amber that held the memory of forgotten eons. The sentinel fixed its gaze upon her. In that look, Kaelin felt a profound and impartial assessment. It did not speak with a mouth. The voice was not a sound heard with ears, but a rumbling presence that resonated directly in her mind. The sound resembled the grinding of mountains and the slow growth of roots through bedrock. It spoke the words that would take the broken pieces of her life and forge them into a single, terrifying purpose. The forest has accepted you. The Heartwood knows its own. The voice was a deep truth that settled in her soul. But the pact is broken. The sigils are lost. The words confirmed the sorrow she had felt in the vision, a heavy and tragic announcement. Then came the final, life-altering question. It was a weight and a choice, laid at the feet of a girl who had been an outcast only a day before. Will you be the one to restore it?
This is Chapter 11. The Memory Stone.
Kaelin remained on her knees in the soft, glowing moss. The world seemed to shift and tilt. The oak sentinel's question, "Will you be the one to restore it?" was not a simple query. It was a weight, a tangible pressure that settled on her soul, so heavy it threatened to crush her. It echoed in the silent spaces of her mind, demanding an answer she did not have, a strength she did not possess. She stared up at the towering, impassive form of the ancient guardian. Its silhouette was a mountain of stone and bark against the golden light of the Heartwood tree. Kaelin's first instinct was a silent, violent rebellion. No, how could she? The vision from the Heartwood had been a terrifying glimpse into a world of immense, primordial wills. The sorrow she had felt was a wound that still ached in her spirit. In the logic of her grief, the pact was not a holy vow. It was the monster that had swallowed her parents. It was the reason she had grown up as a whispered story and a lonely orphan. To accept the Sentinel's offer was to embrace the very path that had led to her own abandonment. A desperate part of her wanted to scramble to her feet and run from this sacred, terrifying place. She wanted to go back to being a girl in a garden. Even if it meant being a hated outcast forever, at least that was a life she understood. This destiny felt like a cage forged from duty. The air in the clearing, once so welcoming, now felt thick with anticipation. The silence of the grove was a waiting, expectant thing. Rowan had been relaxed in the safety of the sanctuary, but he sensed the frantic refusal building inside her. He moved from his spot to press against Kaelin's side, a solid, grounding weight in her reeling world. He gave her trembling hand a soft, reassuring lick. It was a vote of confidence she felt she had not earned. His simple loyalty acted as a shield against the storm of doubt raging in her mind. The Oak Sentinel did not press her for an answer. It seemed to see the storm of refusal and fear raging within her, and chose to wait. Amber eyes, which held the memory of mountains rising and falling, were filled with a deep, immeasurable patience. The guardian was not a judge demanding a plea, but a guide waiting for a choice. When the voice resonated in her mind again, it was softer. Resembled the rustling of ancient leaves rather than the grinding of stone. The choice must be yours. Seed of renewal. The pact cannot be forced. It must be accepted. The voice was a calm sea in her turbulent mind. But to choose, you must first remember. The Heartwood has shown you the power of the pact. Now, the stone will show you the cost. The great guardian turned its massive head with a slow, deliberate motion. It gestured toward a specific part of the grove, a place beyond the monoliths, half hidden within the whispering leaves of the Grove of Echoes. There, lying buried in the moss like a fallen gravestone, was a flat, gray slab of rock. Kaelin knew, with a sinking feeling of inevitability, that she could not leave without understanding the truth. She could not refuse the burden until she truly knew its weight. Pushing herself up on shaky legs, her hand resting on Rowan's back for support, she followed the Sentinel's silent command. She walked toward the stone that held the memory of the price her parents had paid. The Oak Sentinel led her away from the base of the Heartwood tree. Heavy, silent footsteps made the ground tremble as the guardian navigated the grove. They entered the Grove of Echoes, a place sheltered by the low-hanging branches of ancient willows. The grand, temple-like awe of the main clearing was replaced here by a somber atmosphere of remembrance. This was a sanctuary of memory rather than raw power. In the center of this small clearing lay the Memory Stone, a primary slab of the Pact stone circle. This rock appeared to have been moved here, or perhaps the grove had simply grown around it over the centuries. It was a single great slab of flat gray stone, half buried in the moss. Worn smooth by generations of rain and wind, the surface still bore a faint, spiraling pattern carved into its center. It was the same elegant symbol Kaelin wore around her neck. The Sentinel stood back as she approached, a silent observer, granting her the space to face this revelation alone. Rowan padded silently to her side, pressing his warm, furry body against her leg as she knelt before the stone. His silent, unwavering presence was a shield against the cold sorrow emanating from the rock. The air here was cool and still. Kaelin reached out a hesitant hand and touched the stone. It was cool and solid beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the vibrating, living energy of the Heartwood. This was a place of memory, not of raw power. She had a desperate, aching need to understand her parents' fate. She had to know if they had truly abandoned her, or if there was another reason. Taking a deep breath, She placed her palm flat on the carved spiral. The world did not dissolve into chaos. This magic was different. It was focused, personal, and profoundly sad. A new vision enveloped her. A clear, narrative memory that unfolded before her mind's eye with the clarity of a lived experience. Now a silent witness, Kaelin stood in this very grove, but it was the grove of 10 years ago. The Heartwood tree in the distance pulsed with a stronger, healthier light. The air was filled with a tension she could almost taste. Her parents stood before her. They were younger than the faded images in her own memory. Her mother's long, dark hair was braided with small, white flowers. Her face was beautiful, but etched with a weary sorrow. Her father stood beside her. His shoulders were broad and strong, but his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. Knuckles white, he stared at the stone with a desperate, heartbreaking hope. Emotions surged through Kaelin as if they were her own. She felt their immense, overwhelming love for her. The 6-year-old girl they had just left sleeping in the care of a weeping Alara. Beneath the love, she felt their smothering fear of what they were about to do. In that instant, a decade of lonely resentment shattered. They were not abandoning her. They were trying to protect her from a coming darkness they could no longer ignore. They stood before the memory stone, their hands clasped, as they began the ancient ritual to invoke the Pact, their voices low and murmuring. The vision flickered violently. It resembled a candle flame caught in a sudden draft. For a split second, the world stuttered. Kaelin saw her father's face contort, a silent, desperate struggle against something inside him. A shadow, dark and cold, passed behind his eyes. It was a momentary eclipse of his will. His hands trembled as if they were no longer entirely under his own control. The image was one of a man fighting a war on two fronts, one against the darkness outside and one against a traitor within. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the vision stabilized. The shadow vanished. He was once again the determined man, standing beside his wife, his expression grim but resolute. The flicker was gone, leaving Kaelin with a chilling unanswered question that planted itself like a shard of ice in her heart. The vision continued, sceneless once more. She watched her parents press their hands together onto the surface of the memory stone, right where Kaelin's own hand rested now. She heard them speak the ancient words of the Pactkeepers, a low, solemn harmony. She could not understand the specific language, but the meaning resonated through her soul. It was a promise. It was a sacrifice. It was a binding of their own lives to the fate of the forest. She saw the terrible cost of that vow in their eyes, the personal price they were willing to pay to keep the encroaching silence at bay. The vision ended, releasing her with a sudden, gentle sigh. Kaelin found herself breathless and shaking, her hands still pressed against the cold rock. The echoes of her parents' love remained a living presence in the quiet grove. Kaelin snatched her hand back from the memory stone as if the granite had burned her. Stumbling back a step, she gasped for air. The clearing remained the same and the air was still, yet her world had been fundamentally altered. The echoes of the vision remained a vivid, painful imprint on her soul. A heavy truth settled in her chest. Her parents were not mere wanderers lost to the woods. They were soldiers who had fallen in a secret ancient war. The Oak Sentinel's voice returned to her mind, no longer a guide, but a somber arbiter of her fate. "You have seen the burden," the Guardian announced. "You have seen the cost. It is a path of sacrifice and sorrow. They chose it, and they were lost. It is your right to refuse." The great Guardian shifted, the grinding of stone echoing in the quiet grove. Its amber eyes seemed to look right through her, peering back into the deep past. "Understand this, seed of renewal. Blood provides the key, but it does not turn the lock. I have seen many with your spark choose the path of silence. I have seen others choose the path of the tyrant. The pact is not a birthright. It is a burden that must be claimed. The sentinel's gaze dropped back to the faint handprints of her parents. Your parents were different. They did not hide from their spark, nor did they let it turn them to cruelty. Your parents claimed it 10 years ago. Today, the choice is yours. The offer was a shock, a sudden, unexpected door opening in the wall of her destiny. Walk away, the sentinel continued, its voice a low, rumbling truth. The forest will not stop you. You can live out your life as a girl with a secret, and the forest will continue its slow slide into silence. This was the moment of truth, a choice real, tangible, and solely hers to make. The logical part of her, the part that had learned to survive in a world that was cruel and unforgiving, screamed at her to take the offer. The vision had been a warning, a roadmap to ruin. It proved that this path led only to loss. Why should she, a girl who had already lost everything to this war, follow her parents into that same oblivion? Why embrace the source of her heartbreak? Kaelin could walk away, find a new village and a new life, extinguishing the spark inside her until it was buried so deep it would never be found. She could be safe. She was a single thread being pulled in two opposite, powerful directions. The promise of a quiet, ordinary life was a seductive song. But then she remembered. She recalled the other half of the vision, not the sacrifice, but the reason behind it. The overwhelming, protective love of her parents was a force so strong they had walked into the dark to keep it from touching her. Ilara's voice returned to her, a small point of light in the panic. A heritage, not a curse. Kaelin thought of the gray rot and the sterile, lifeless scent clinging to Edgehaven. She saw again her dying moon petals, their color leached away by the silence. She saw the vibrant life of the forest being harvested and erased. She knew she had to stand against it. To walk away now would be to let that darkness win. It would be a betrayal of her parents' love, rendering their ultimate sacrifice meaningless. It would mean watching the world they died to protect be consumed by the very silence they had fought. Her gaze fell upon the memory stone. In the golden light of the grove, the ghostly outlines where her parents' hands had once rested were still visible. They were a testament, a signature left on the heart of the world. The world blurred as tears streamed down Kaelin's face. They were not tears of fear, but of a profound and heartbreaking clarity. With a deep, shuddering breath, she made her choice. This was not a decision made from a sense of grand destiny, nor from a desire for adventure. It was not the choice of a hero. It was the choice of a daughter. It was a simple, absolute commitment, made out of love for the parents she barely knew and for the singing forest that was their shared heritage. She looked up, her gaze meeting the ancient, amber eyes of the oak sentinel. Kaelin did not need to speak aloud. The entire forest was listening. Her answer blazed from her heart, directly into the ancient Vardian's mind. A quiet and resolute promise that sealed her fate forever. I will do it.
This is Chapter 12, The Law of Endurance.
The Grove of Echoes remained in a state of absolute, breathless suspension. A silent and resonant weight defined the air. A pressure so heavy it felt as though the very atoms of the forest were holding their breath, waiting for Kaelin's unspoken vow to settle into the bedrock. Her choice hung in the silver light of the willows like a thread of spun silk. It was a new and permanent addition to the ancient tapestry of her family's story. Standing as a mountain of moss and memory, the oak sentinel gave a slow, deep nod. This gesture acted as a solemn acceptance, the forest itself acknowledging that the key had finally been turned. Kaelin knelt before the memory stone, her fingers still trembling from the heat of the vision she had just witnessed. The stone was a primary slab of the Pact stone circle. Yet here in the Grove of Echoes, it felt more like a private altar. It sat half-buried in a bed of velvety moss, its surface worn smooth by generations of rain and wind. The faint, spiraling pattern carved into its center was a mirror of the wooden pendant resting against Kaelin's heart. The sentinel stood back, a silent observer, granting her the space to claim her place in history. Rowan padded to her side and pressed his warm body against her leg. His unwavering presence acted as a shield against the cold sorrow still emanating from the rock. Kaelin looked at the names already etched there, tracing the curves of the letters with her mind. At the top, the name of Lyra was little more than a ghost in the granite. Below it, hundreds of other names formed a river of history. Then she saw them. The names of her mother and father were fresh, raw wounds in the memory of the stone. 10 years of resentment, the feeling of being abandoned, and the belief that she was unloved finally dissolved into the soil. They had not left her. They had simply gone ahead to prepare the way. They had walked into the dark so she could one day find the light. A hard core of purpose solidified within Kaelin's chest. Sliding the worn leather satchel from her shoulder, she reached inside. Her fingers bypassed the healing herbs and the remaining honeycakes, seeking a specific weight. It closed around the smooth wooden handle of her small pruning knife. This was a simple tool, a relic of her life as a gardener, now destined for a work of cosmic masonry. Kaelin did not attempt to carve a grand, mystical symbol. She chose to use her own name. Pressing the tip of the blade to the granite, she found a space just below the traces of her parents' handprints. The stone was harder than any wood she had ever worked. It resisted her with a stubborn, ancient pride. With a careful and deliberate pressure, she began to etch the first letter. The sound of steel scraping against stone was the only noise in the sanctuary. It was a sharp, grating, and deeply human sound in a place of silent magic. Steel bit into the ancient granite, scraping as it went. Kaelin's shoulder burned, and her knuckles turned white as she forced the blade through the stone's stubborn, ancient pride. This wasn't just carving. It was a war. The first stroke was a jagged scar, 1,000 years of silence pushed back against her, trying to dull the steel blade with the weight of ancient history. As the knife bit into the granite, the scent of her mother's hair flared in her mind. It carried the perfume of crushed leaves and summer rain, a phantom comfort from a lost life. This carving was for the woman who had sung to the stars. It was for the mother who had walked into the dark so her daughter could see the light. A rhythmic jarring traveled from the stone to her shoulder, a vibration so intense it made her teeth ache. The second letter was a battle against the weight of the village. As the steel carved the crossbar, the word hagkin echoed in her mind, a cold and sharp insult. Finn's sneer and Elder Thane's stony judgment flickered before her eyes while the sterile, dusty smell of the gray rot clawed at her throat. She recalled her father's large hands covering her ears when she was a child. A silent, protective command to ignore the village's noise and listen only to the soil. They fear what they cannot harvest, little sprout. This letter was her answer to Edgehaven. Refusing to be a monster or a blight, Kaelin stood as a woman of the wood, a soul reclaiming the identity they had tried to strip away. The third letter required a deeper focus. The granite was dense here, refusing to yield. Her knuckles turned white as she fought the stone. Sweat beaded on her forehead and stung her eyes, yet the work continued. The memory of the open door she had left behind flared in her mind. It had been a small act of defiance and a refusal to be erased. With every scrape of the knife, she anchored the truth of her existence into the bedrock. No longer a ghost in her own life, Kaelin acted as a physical presence, carving her story into the very foundation of the world. The fourth letter felt lighter. She thought of Rowan. She pictured his one-eyed face and the rough, familiar texture of his fur. He was the only one who had never looked at her with fear. He was the only one who had never stayed silent when she was hurting. This letter was for loyalty. It was for the silent guardian who is currently watching her from the moss. White dust from the rock coated her fingers, looking like bone ash in the golden light. She was no longer just carving stone. She was carving her place in the world. A single vertical line. The fifth letter was a pillar of resolve. Images of that soundless, sunken glade returned to haunt her. She recalled the weightless white fog where the world had been stripped of scent and sensation, the place where sound itself went to die. She felt again the creeping onset of sensory death, and the moment she had discovered the tiny, flickering ember of her own spirit in the heart of that absolute nothingness. I am Kaelin, she thought. The words, a silent shout in the quiet grove. I am here. I am real. The I was the straightest line on the stone, a testament to the internal light that the forest could not extinguish. The final letter was a struggle of exhaustion. Her hand began to cramp, the muscles in her forearms screaming from the repetitive strain. She thought of her father's unyielding strength, the way he had once carried her home through a summer storm, his pace steady and his arms a fortress against the thunder. She reached for the memory of that stability now, using the ghost of his strength to steady her failing grip. She pressed the blade one last time, forcing the steel to finish what she had started. The N was slightly crooked, a testament to the trembling humanity behind her resolve. It was imperfect, just like her. It was flawed, just like the forest. She completed the stroke and drew the knife back, letting it rest in her lap. Her name now sat in the gray stone as a set of fresh white lines beneath the weathered marks of her mother and father. She had physically and symbolically claimed her place. She looked at the three names, bound together by choice and by tragedy. A wave of stinging heat for the family she never had, and a surge of fierce pride for the legacy she had accepted, swelled in her chest. It was a single, powerful, and heartbreaking beat. It is recorded. The sentinel's voice rumbled within her mind. The name is claimed, but understand the weight of the path you have chosen. Seed of renewal. The law of stonebark is not a weapon for the swift or a shield for the weak. It is the law of endurance. It is the strength to remain standing when the world falls silent. It is the foundation upon which all other laws are built. Now we return to the heart. The vow must be sealed where the song is loudest. The colossus began to move, turning back toward the main clearing. Every step the sentinel took was a monumental event. The ground groaned under the weight of stone and ironwood, and the blooming veins beneath his feet flared with an intense gold as the earth rejoiced at his wakefulness. Kaelin followed, her own footsteps feeling small and fragile in the wake of such immense power. They walked back through the Heartgrove, passing beneath the curtain of weeping willows. The air grew thicker and warmer as they approached the center, smelling of the sweet, sharp scent of ancient resin. Kaelin watched as the sanctuary reacted to the sentinel's presence. Birds with feathers like autumn leaves took flight in silent, orchestrated patterns. Small, stone-skinned lizards scurried into the cracks of the monoliths, their eyes glowing with the same amber light as the guardians. The forest was waking up, shedding the stagnation of the hush as the first law prepared to bind itself to a new host. They reached the base of the Heartwood tree. The massive trunk towered above them, its wounded breech pulsing with a steady golden light. This was the primary Packstone circle. Stand, the sentinel decreed. The vow must be sealed in the presence of the Heartwood. 3 questions I ask of the candidate. Answer not with words, but with the truth of your spirit. Kaelin stood, her legs feeling like lead, but her gaze remained level with the sentinel's amber eyes. When the stillness comes for your memories, what will remain? The guardian asked. The question hit her like a physical blow, dragging her mind back to the cottage, the village, and the gray dust of the rot. Kaelin thought of her mother's hair, the smell of the rain, and the tiny wren she had whittled for Alara. She pictured Rowan's one-eyed face and the warmth of his fur. "Love," her spirit answered, a pulse of warmth that the sentinel acknowledged with a slight tilt of its head. "When the fire of change burns away the world you know, what will you hold?" Images of her garden, ruined by the rot, and her home, lost to the banishment, rose unbidden. The open door she had left behind remained a sharp memory, a tiny, lingering act of defiance. It was a truth that settled deep within her spirit, that while everything physical could be stripped away, the will to continue could not. Hope, she projected, a fierce and stubborn light in the dark of her mind. "And when the void opens beneath your feet, will you stand?" Kaelin remembered the Foggrave Hollow. During the vision at the Heartwood tree, the names of the places she had survived had been etched into her mind as if they were labels on an ancient map. She recalled the sensory death of the white void and the tiny flame she had found within herself. She didn't answer with a concept this time. She answered with a memory of the shifting Fenstones, of her fingers bleeding as they gripped the rock to pull herself back from the dark water. "I will stand," she resolved. The sentinel gave a slow, deep nod. The air in the grove seemed to thicken, charged with the approval of the Heartwood itself. The time for deliberation had ended. The ceremony was about to begin. Slowly, the ancient protector raised a great stony limb. It was a hand forged from the very elements of the forest, fingers of iron-hard bark, a palm of moss-covered rock, and joints that moved with the patience of deep time. The sentinel extended this offering toward her, a silent demand for trust. Kaelin understood what was required. Her heart pounded a heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was the moment the legend became a reality. The pact would no longer be a choice she had made. It would become a physical, undeniable part of her, a mark on her very flesh and bone. She held out her left forearm. Her skin looked pale and vulnerable in the golden light of the grove. This was her final offering. She was ready for the pain and the power to follow. The sentinel's massive fingers descended. They closed around her forearm with a pressure that seemed to find her very bones. The rough texture of the bark was a strange contrast against her soft skin. The contrast was immense. The ancient guardian of the Elderbranch, and the girl who was now its only hope. To her surprise, the sentinel's touch was not cold. It was warm. The hand pulsed with the same life-giving energy as the Heartwood tree itself. It was the heat of sun-warmed rock and life that endures through ages. A connection was forged in that single touch. Bark met bone as ancient spirit greeted young flesh. The energy from the sentinel began to flow. A deep and resonant hum started in Kaelin's arm before vibrating through her entire being. It was an ancient song beginning to rewrite her very soul. The hum intensified. Comfort gave way to an overwhelming surge as the gentle vibration escalated into a roar of energy. The warmth became a searing white-hot heat, a wave of raw magic that flooded Kaelin's arm and crashed through her entire body. Molten rock seemed to pour into her veins. A raw scream tore itself from her throat, a sound involuntary and absolute. This was an agony beyond physical injury. The pain felt both fiery hot and stone cold. Every nerve in her body screamed in protest, yet through a red haze of suffering, a single thought burned. I chose this. This is mine. The golden light of the grove fractured into 1,000 brilliant shards as her vision swam. This was not the gentle bestowing of a gift. It was a forging. The ancient magic of the Elderbranch was rewriting her. It was binding itself to her mortal flesh while her body resisted the violent transformation. She felt the magic sinking deeper, bypassing her muscle to coil around her very bones. It was the feeling of bones turning to ironwood. Her consciousness began to slip, battered by the sheer volume of the forest's power. She felt the roots of the Heartgrove answering the call. The entire sanctuary vibrated in sympathy with the mark being made on her arm. Through the fog of pain, Kaelin looked down. The sentinel's unyielding grip anchored her to the earth as her skin began to glow with an intensity that rivaled the sun. A pattern traced in lines of brilliant light burned itself into existence. It originated as a single point of unbearable radiance in the center of her forearm, before spiraling outward to etch itself into her skin. This was the first sigil she had seen in the chaotic vision of the tree. Now she understood its meaning in her very bones. The sigil of stonebark, a perfect and elegant spiral. The lines were clean and sure. The symbol sat housed within a larger, circular pattern that resembled the growth rings of an ancient oak. These were not mere marks on her skin. The lines looked like living wood. They resembled golden saplings growing directly into her flesh, their roots taking hold in her skeletal frame. The sigil pulsed with a life of its own, a miniature version of the Heartwood's rhythmic beat. It was the law of endurance, written in her own blood. The infusion of power reached its peak. The sheer and violent beauty of the connection was too great for a mortal frame to bear. Kaelin's world dissolved into a spiraling blur of gold and deep green. Strength fled from her knees. She felt her mind fracturing under the immense, crushing weight of the law she now carried. She was no longer just Kaelin of Edgehaven. She was a vessel for the forest's survival. As she began to collapse, the last thing Kaelin registered was a sound. It was a deep and collective rush of wind that swept through the entire grove. A noise felt impossibly like the great trees of the Elderbranch were bowing in recognition. Her consciousness, overwhelmed and remade, finally surrendered. Kaelin faded into a deep and blessedly welcome blackness. The binding was complete.
This is Chapter 13, The Heavy Foundation.
Golden light, filtered through the high, star-scraping canopy of the Heartwood, arrived as a silent beckoning that pulled Kaelin back from the dark. She lay still for a long moment, her senses returning in slow, tentative ripples. The air in the sanctuary was cool and held a new, crystalline clarity. Every rustle of the willow leaves sounded like a sharp intake of breath, vibrating against the back of her throat. Ancient resin coated the inside of her lungs with every breath, thick and sticky, clinging to the back of her throat, refusing to be exhaled. Her spirit had been forged into something sharp and cold, yet as she tried to shift, the earth reached up and gripped her. An invisible hand pulled at her left side, pinning her to the moss. Rowan sat a few feet away, his one intelligent eye fixed on her with a look of quiet, canine expectation. He did not bark or nudge her. He simply waited for her to acknowledge the change. Turning her head, Kaelin looked for the oak sentinel. The towering colossus she had spoken to was gone. In its place stood the same moss-covered boulder she had seen upon her arrival, a silent, unmoving mountain of gray stone and petrified bark. The points of amber light had vanished from its features. The guardian had returned to the dormancy of the earth, leaving Kaelin alone with a promise as heavy as the stone itself. A stray strand of hair tickled her cheek, and she instinctively reached up to brush it away. Her brain was still calibrated for a girl of flesh and bone, yet her left arm possessed a mass that defied logic. The limb did not respond with a familiar, light grace. It moved with the sudden, fossilized weight of solid lead. Instead of a gentle touch, her knuckles slammed into her forehead with a hollow, wooden clack. Kaelin gasped as stars exploded in her vision. Her head snapped back against the moss, her skull ringing as if she had been struck by a falling branch. The arm refused to acknowledge her command. It lay beside her like a discarded beam, a foreign object she was forced to drag along behind her shoulder. She stared at her forearm, where the dark, root-like lines of the stonebark sigil remained silent and hushed. The skin around the mark felt tight and unnaturally firm. A hide of leather stretched over a core of unyielding granite. Moving with extreme caution, she tried to sit up. She rolled onto her right side and planted her left hand on the forest floor to push herself upward. The ground offered no support. As soon as she applied pressure, her left hand sank. It did not just compress the moss, it punched through the velvety green and drove deep into the rich, dark soil, burying her up to the wrist. She felt like a sapling that had grown a branch of solid granite on one side, threatening to pull her entire frame into the dirt. Every time she tried to heave her torso to the right, the arm acted like an anchor, pinning her to the mud. 16 years of instinct failed her. Reaching, bracing, lifting, actions once as natural as breathing, had become a complex problem of physics and will. She was a stranger in her own skin, a creature of soft flesh trying to carry the world in a single, petrified arm. Rowan tilted his head, letting out a short, sharp huff. It was a canine sigh that felt suspiciously like a laugh. Kaelin glared at him, her breath coming in rasping pants. She tried to lift the arm again, focusing every ounce of her concentration on the task. Her shoulder muscles bunched and strained until they burned. The tendons in her neck stood out like cords. The arm rose an inch, then two, before falling back into the dirt with a heavy, humiliating splash of mud. She was the seed of renewal and the key to the Pact, yet she looked like a beetle flipped on its back, struggling against her own gravity. The Oak Sentinel's words returned to her now as a low, rumbling memory. The law of stonebark is not a weapon for the swift or a shield for the weak. It is the law of endurance. It is the strength to remain standing when the world falls silent. Standing felt like a distant, impossible dream. She looked at her hand, still buried in the earth, and realized the first thing she had to endure was her own power. Rowan's amusement finally faded. He rose from his haunches, padding across the emerald moss with soundless steps toward the muddy hollow where Kaelin remained pinned by her own weight. The dog offered no help. He did not even nudge her toward the safety of her discarded satchel. Instead, he performed a gesture that defied every canine instinct. He pressed his right front paw firmly against the stonebark sigil marking her skin. The contact was a jolt, a sudden, low-frequency vibration that raced from his pads into her skin. Kaelin tried to pull her arm away. The movement only drove her hand deeper into the soil. "Rowan, stop," she hissed, her face flushed with the heat of her own failure. "I can't move it. It's too heavy. I'm not strong enough." His canine eye, bright with an ancient intelligence, met hers. He did not move his paw. Instead, he intensified the vibration. A resonant thrum began to hum within the clearing, a sound that originated not from his throat, but from his very connection to the earth. It matched the rhythmic beat Kaelin had felt from the Heartwood tree. As the hum grew louder, the dark lines on Kaelin's arm began to react. The root-like patterns of the sigil did not glow with the violent intensity of the forging. Instead, they began to pulse with a slow and steady amber light, the color of sun-warmed sap. The vibration sank through her muscle and into her bones. Understanding sank into her, deep as the mountain's roots. Her struggle had been a fundamental error of logic. Mortal tendons and the simple strength of a village girl were never meant to move such mass. Pitting her flesh against a weight that belonged to the mountain was a fool's errand. Kaelin had to stop fighting the stone. The limb was not a burden to be lifted, but an anchor to be grounded. To stand, she had to become it. "Remember the song," she whispered to herself. a frantic attempt to recall the harmony she had felt at the tree. The futile struggle ceased. Her breath slowed as Kaelin matched her heartbeat to the rhythmic pulse of the sigil. With her eyes closed, she turned her focus inward, sifting through the silence for the specific frequency Rowan sent humming through his touch. Mortal strength was not the answer. Instead of force, she searched for harmony, a way to move with the stone rather than against it. Kaelin found the note, a deep, subvocal hum that resonated in the hollows of her bones. She sang the note back to her own arm, projecting her will into the dark, wooden lines of the sigil. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The dragging, heavy sensation vanished. The limb did not become light in the way a feather is light. It became a part of the earth's own balance. The mass remained, but it no longer fought her. The sigil vibrated with a deep and grounded resonance as the petrified stiffness transformed into a sturdy, unyielding power. Moving with a slow and deliberate grace, Kaelin lifted her left hand. The limb rose effortlessly, shedding the 4 inches of mud as if it were nothing more than water. The hand appeared unchanged in the morning light, yet an impossible density was now settled within her arm. Gone was the earlier clumsiness. In its place, a profound sense of solidity took root. Kaelin was no longer a girl out of balance. Rowan withdrew his paw. A single, sharp bark erupted from his throat, a note of pure approval that echoed through the quiet willows. To Kaelin, the sound arrived as more than a noise. It felt like a bolt of support that traveled down her spine and grounded her flickering resolve. Kaelin placed both hands on the earth and pushed. Under her hands, the moss and the soil held strong. The ground no longer swallowed her weight. Instead, it offered a solid resistance that answered the unyielding earth now anchored within her frame. Her body rose with the slow, inevitable power of a standing stone being righted. She stood up for the first time as a Pactkeeper. Beneath her, the forest floor felt different. Her feet planted themselves in the dirt with a grip so deep, it seemed as though she could withstand a hurricane. The world was no longer a place that threatened to knock her down. It was a place she was now built to endure. "I understand," Kaelin breathed, looking down at the silver dog. "It isn't about lifting. It's about becoming the stone." The transition from the Heartgrove struck like a physical blow. Crossing the invisible boundary of the sanctuary, the nourishing warmth of the Heartwood tree vanished. A biting, sterile chill replaced it. The air pressed against her skin like a layer of damp iron, leaching the very warmth from her blood. The scent of ancient resin died. In its place, the parched odor of the gray rot returned, carrying the sharp, chalky tang of bone dust. The vibrant colors of the sanctuary were a memory. Here, the forest was a gallery of gray shadows and unmoving skeletons. Rowan halted at the edge of a clearing. A low vibration thrummed in his chest. The forest floor had given way to a lightless, crumbling pit, a massive sinkhole where the roots had turned to dust, leaving nothing but a thin crust of soil to hold back the dark. Once sturdy enough to support the weight of the wood, the timber had been turned to brittle ash. Under the pressure of the earth, the petrified wood had snapped like dry glass, causing a catastrophic collapse of the soil. Dust still hung in the heavy air, a slow, gray haze of ground roots that caught the light like thousands of tiny, dead scales suspended in the gloom. A sound of grinding granite rose from the depths of the pit. Kaelin stepped toward the crumbling edge. Her boots possessed a new, impossible gravity. They did not slip on the loose earth, but found a stubborn and heavy grip that made her feel as though she were part of the very foundation she stood upon. At the bottom of the 15-foot drop lay a creature of the deep wood, a stone-clad turtle. It looked more like a piece of the mountain than a living animal. A sharp, wordless grief caught in Kaelin's throat as she watched the ancient creature struggle. The forest was betraying its own, turning its patient strength into a cage of ash. turtle's shell was a single, massive slab of weathered granite. Small, delicate wildflowers had once carpeted the stone, but they were now wilting. The tiny, vibrant world on the creature's back was snuffed out, dust settling over the petals until the last trace of color vanished beneath the gray. A fallen, petrified log pinned the turtle's front legs to the floor of the pit. Every struggle drew more debris down from the unstable walls. The dry, rasping sound of earth sliding over stone echoed through the hollow, the sound of the forest burying its own children. Dust rained onto the turtle's head. With every rasping, labored pull of its lungs, the ashen grit threatened to clog the airway and steal the last of its strength. The rot continued its patient meal at the edges of the sinkhole. Fresh clumps of earth tumbled into the shadows. Survival was now a matter of minutes. The turtle turned its head. Its eyes were great, liquid pools of amber, clouded by centuries. It moved with a painful slowness that made Kaelin's own sigil thrum in sympathy. The animal did not cry out. It simply watched Kaelin, a silent witness to its own unmaking. The creature was too heavy to climb and too trapped to hide. It was a victim of the silence, waiting for the end. The frustration of her earlier clumsiness evaporated. A fierce, protective heat took its place. Kaelin realized her new strength was not a gift for herself, nor was it a tool to be used in a quiet garden. She had been given the sigil of stonebark to act as a foundation for those who could no longer hold themselves up. "I see you," she whispered into the pit. A sudden, electric tension made the fur along Rowan's back prickle and stand on end. He watched her with a silent, predatory alertness as the crumbling soil prepared to surrender to the dark. The ground sounded like it was going to swallow the creature whole. Kaelin didn't hesitate. She tightened the straps of her satchel and prepared to descend into the ruin. The edge of the sinkhole groaned as more soil gave way. Kaelin didn't wait for a spirit's command or a sign from the trees. She scrambled down the steep, crumbling slope, her heavy left arm acting as a counterweight that nearly pulled her face first into the dirt. Dust choked her lungs, tasting of dry minerals and the bitter ash of the rot. At the bottom of the pit, the stone-clad turtle resembled a jagged fragment of living bedrock. It lay hopelessly pinned beneath the crushing, suffocating weight of a petrified oak log that had collapsed across its front legs. The animal's amber eyes found hers. "I've got you," she whispered. The sound was a small human vibration in the hollow silence. A sharp crack echoed through the crumbling hollow. Above her, the eastern wall of the sinkhole began to slide, releasing a mass of roots and stones, held together by nothing but the memory of their own strength. Tons of earth prepared to bury them both. Fear flared, yet the instinct to flee never reached Kaelin's legs. A cold, hard clarity surged from the sigil of stonebark, sharpening her focus until the world seemed to slow to a crawl. Abandoning all thought of safety, Kaelin stepped between the ancient creature and the descending mountain of earth. Her boots bit fiercely through the loose soil to anchor her frame in the dense, unyielding earth buried below. With her heavy left arm raised, she pressed her palm flat against the cold, cascading face of the collapsing wall. "Stand," she commanded. The word vibrated with the low thrum of the sigil. The jolt traveled through her wrist and hammered into her shoulder. The pressure of the collapsing dirt tried to fold her spine, yet the sigil of stonebark held her rigid. Magic bypassed her muscle to coil around her bones, reinforcing the arm until it possessed the endurance of ironwood. A torrent of loose topsoil and shattered roots cascaded over her shoulders, threatening to bury her alive beneath a suffocating wave of gray ash. The sheer, crushing mass of the collapsing wall tried to drive her to her knees in the shadows, yet Kaelin refused to yield. The weight was immense. This was the strength the Sentinel had promised. This was the power to remain standing. "Rowan, now." The dog acted without a heartbeat of delay. He moved to the petrified log with his paws light on the shifting debris. pushing his weight beneath the timber. He used the leverage of a nearby stone to shift the burden just enough. The turtle found its release. With a slow, grinding effort, the ancient creature pulled its legs free. It began the arduous climb up the root ladder Kaelin had cleared during her descent. Teeth aching from the pressure, Kaelin held the line. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She was the only thing standing between a living creature and the silence of the earth. A memory of her father flared through the white-hot strain. She saw him lifting the massive main beam of their cottage after a winter storm. He had stood with his feet rooted and his shoulders square, an unbreakable wall against the ruin. He had been a fortress for her then. Now she was becoming a fortress for the forest. Her left arm felt as if it were turning to granite. The skin grew cold and hard, yet as the turtle reached the top, a fierce joy ignited in her chest. Kaelin was not a monster. She was the foundation. With a final explosive push of her will, she shoved the wall back and threw herself toward the slope. Behind her, the sinkhole collapsed with a sound like a falling sky. A cloud of gray dust billowed out, coating the moss in a layer of ash. Kaelin lay at the top of the ridge, gasping for air. Her left arm was heavy once more, but as she looked at the turtle, safely navigating the thicket, the weight no longer felt like a burden. It was a badge of office. Kaelin remained on the ridge for a long moment. Her left hand rested flat against the moss, still grounding the excess energy from the sigil of stonebark. The quiet rustle of the ancient creature retreating into the undergrowth should have been the only sound in the settling dust. Yet a cold and sudden tremor traveled up Kaelin's grounded arm, a sequence of heavy, measured impacts beating through the deep earth with an unnatural and terrifying precision. Nature possessed a predictable rhythm. Kaelin knew the light, erratic dance of a deer and the heavy, rolling gait of a bear. She had spent a decade reading the language of the soil. This new tremor was different. Each thud was spaced with a flawless, lethal calculation. The rhythm was hauntingly familiar. It sounded like the steady, heavy crack of her father's wood axe against the chopping block in the early morning. The vibration shuddered through her bones, making the sigil of stonebark flare with a sharp, sickening cold as the living magic within her instinctively recoiled from the lifeless impacts. Suddenly, the sanctuary died. The cheerful chatter of the spirit birds and the steady hum of insects vanished in a heartbeat. It was not a natural quiet. It was a hostile, consuming pressure that forcibly crushed the joyous noise out of the air until nothing but a sterile vacuum remained. The song of the Heartgrove was being smothered by an encroaching, sterile silence. A cold spot formed in the air, moving toward the clearing with the inevitability of a winter frost. This was the hush made mobile. This was the stillness hunting for a target. Rowan stood over Kaelin. A jagged ridge of fur rose along his spine. Amidst the matted brown of his dirty coat, a hidden stripe of silver flared in the golden light of the forest. It cut through the layers of dust like a sliver of liquid moonlight. He did not growl. He simply stared into the dark thicket with his one good eye fixed and lethal. The scent of forgetting arrived on a sudden, airless draft. The dry odor of old bones and ashen dust. Rowan recognized the presence. He knew that the predator they had sensed in the vault was on the move. The cold, unyielding presence was actively closing the distance, carving a path of silence. Sanctuary was a lie. The Heartgrove could no longer act as a shield. "He has my scent," Kaelin whispered, a shard of ice in her chest. She didn't know who was coming, only that the silence had identified her as the source of the noise. The memory of the hunter's cold, calculated march from her vision returned. It was a rigid and unswerving line of purpose, carved straight through the ancient woods, refusing to bend or alter its course for any natural barrier. Kaelin scrambled to her feet, with her left arm dragging like dead weight. The sheer, petrified mass was a constant reminder of the vow that now bound her to the deep earth. She couldn't hide, and she couldn't return to the village. She had to move, trusting her new, ironwood bones to endure the journey. Kaelin turned toward the deeper woods. Rowan took the lead, his form a ghost in the shadows. They fled into the trees, just as the first gray frost began to creep over the ridge, turning the vibrant moss into a brittle crust of ash.
She went into that pit, a frightened girl. She came out a foundation. But there is no rest for her now. Something walks the forest in a straight line, leaving only silence behind it. And it has her scent. She cannot hide. She can only run. And the loyal creature running at her side is about to show her what he has truly been all along. I remain the first memory. Watch the shadows, for they are watching you.